Tonight, we travel to the Kontor of Bruges, on a March morning in the year 1419, when Bruges was still part of the county of Flanders under French rule. The first light is grey upon the canals. In the upper story of a timber-framed house near the Jan van Eyckplein, a man from Lübeck named Hildebrand Weckenhusen has already risen. He washes his hands in cold water, dresses in a woolen robe dyed dark, and descends to the counting house where ledgers lie open from the previous evening. You are standing at the narrow window of the upper counting house, your breath faintly visible in the cold air that moves across your face. Around you, the long chamber stretches into shadow, its heavy ceiling beams still lost in darkness above, while below your feet the floorboards creak softly with the damp that has risen overnight from the canal running past the warehouse door. The smell of tallow and beeswax lingers from the extinguished candles of the previous evening, mingling now with the sharper scent of river fog pressing against the horn-paned windows. You are Hildebrand Weckenhusen, a late medieval merchant, and you have risen before the rest of the house to examine the previous day's entries in your ledger, while the city of Bruges still sleeps. The grey-green light filtering through the windows begins to separate the shapes in the room. The counting table where your brother Sivert sat until late, the chest bound with iron where the sealed letters from Lübeck await your reply, the shelf of 10 account books that you and Sivert have kept across 20 years of trade. You move across the creaking floorboards, the wood swollen with the damp of the canal, and reach for the rushlight you prepared before retiring. The flame catches with a whisper, and the small circle of illumination reveals the open page where your own hand stopped at the 10th hour, calculating the exchange rates for the coming Flemish cloth purchase against your Lübeck credit. The Hanseatic League, which many historians believe developed from a Kaufmannschanz to a Stedtihans by the mid-14th century, with some of the earliest nearly general Hansetages held around this time, has made such calculations possible across numerous sea and inland cities of northern Europe, though the exact timing and demarcation between Kaufmannschanz and Stedtihans remains disputed among historians. The scratch of goose quill on heavy paper resumes as you add a marginal note, your hands steady despite the chill that has settled into the counting house at first light. You record the arrival expected from Bergen with dried fish and train oil, a cargo that will determine whether your spring conv to the Baltic can sail before the ice breaks on the Trav. The term Hansa or Hence was also used by other merchant alliances as far as Austria, though these were usually brotherhoods of individual traders rather than political alliances between cities. The Hansa was an important factor not only economically, but also politically and culturally, and in this upper room above the Bruges Canal, you feel that importance in the weight of your quill and the careful formation of each letter. The distant clatter of wooden shoes on cobblestones drifts through the shuttered windows as the first labourers arrive at the quay, their voices carrying across the still water in the Flemish dialect that you understand but do not speak with ease. German, as a distinct language, has roots in the 8th century, developing into numerous dialects, and if you are from Westphalia, the Low German of your homeland may sit more naturally in your mouth than the sounds of this Burgundian city. Yet Bruges was one of the centres of textile industry and long-distance trade in late medieval Europe, and thus one of the birthplaces of early capitalism. And under Burgundian rule, Bruges became one of the economically and culturally richest cities in Europe. So you have learned to listen as carefully as you speak. The medieval core of Bruges was declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2000, though you cannot know this as you stand at your window, watching the mist begin to lift from the water where the first cogs of the morning are already visible. The cog became a symbol of the Hansa due to the development of maritime transport, and you might identify the hull shape of the nearest vessel even through the obscuring fog, its high sides and flat bottom suited for the shallow harbours of the Baltic coast. Many Hanseatic cities achieved considerable wealth through trade, evidenced by numerous significant buildings, and the Kontor at Bruges, where you now stand, is itself such evidence. Its stone walls and tiled roof maintained with support from the merchants who live and work within its protection. The Hanseatic colours were red and white, still visible in many Hanseatic city coats of arms, and somewhere in the chest below, among your correspondence, you keep a small banner in those colours that you have not unfurled since the last General Assembly you attended in Lübeck, before your brother Seivert's gout made such travel difficult. The sound of the first bells from the Church of Our Lady drifts through the shuttered windows, each stroke measured and deliberate, calling none to worship yet, but marking the passage of time for those already at labour. You count the bells, your quill suspended above the page, and when they cease you make a fresh notation in the margin, dating your calculation to this hour when the city begins to wake around you. You and Seivert left behind more than 500 letters and 10 account books, providing exceptional documentation of late medieval merchant life. Though in this moment you write only for the immediate need, the record of credit extended and expected return, the careful balance of trust and obligation that sustains trade across the distances between Bruges and Bergen. Between the Kontor where you stand and the warehouse in Lübeck, where your eldest son now oversees the northern end of your operations. The cold rim of a pewter cup against your lip announces the arrival of the servant from the communal kitchen below, a young man whose name you have never fully learned in 3 years of morning service. The warmed wine and dry bread are placed upon the corner of the counting table with the quiet efficiency that the Kontor expects, and you acknowledge the service with a gesture rather than words, your attention still upon the column of figures that must balance before the cloth merchants arrive at the 3rd hour. The servant withdraws, his wooden shoes soft upon the stair, and you are alone again with the tallow smell and the grey-green light, and the distant sounds of the quay coming fully to life. You sip the wine, noting its thinness, the second pressing that the communal kitchen reserves for the early hours before the better vintages are brought from the cellar for the day's proper business. The bread is yesterday's, hard at the edges, but you have eaten worse on the road between Lübeck and Hamburg, between Hamburg and the Rhine cities, where merchant alliances flourished in looser forms. Such distinctions matter to you now as you calculate your position, for the cloth you hope to purchase this morning will travel not under the protection of some loose brotherhood, but under the sealed privileges that the Hanseatic League has negotiated with the Burgundian court, the accumulated weight of nearly 300 sea and inland cities of northern Europe standing behind your single transaction. The scratch of goose quill on heavy paper resumes, then pauses, as you turn to examine a letter received 8 days since from your correspondent in Bergen. The dried fish and train oil you expect are described in the cramped handwriting of a clerk who has never seen the sea, the quantities estimated, the quality guaranteed by a merchant you have met only once, in a general assembly whose date you no longer precisely recall. The exact demarcation between Kaufmannschanz and Stedtehans is disputed among historians, and you, living through the transition, could not have named the moment when merchants' associations became cities' alliances. You know only that your father's generation spoke of the Hansa as men speak of their guild, while your sons will speak of it as men speak of their country. The floorboards creak underfoot as you move to the window again, the wood swollen with the damp of the canal, and you push the horn-paned shutter a finger's width to admit the morning air. The grey-green light strengthens, revealing the full activity of the quay now. The cogs tied alongside each other 3 deep, the cranes beginning their day's lifting, the first barrels rolling across the cobblestones toward the warehouse doors. The distant clatter of wooden shoes on cobblestones grows continuous as more labourers arrive, their calls to one another forming a pattern that you have learned to read as another man might read music, knowing from the pitch and rhythm whether the loading goes well or ill. You will send your own clerk to inquire before the 2nd hour, but for now you stand at your narrow window, the cold air moving across your face, and listen. The smell of tallow and beeswax from the extinguished candles of the previous evening has begun to fade, replaced by the sharper smells of the quay rising through the opened shutter. River mud and tarred rope, the particular salt sweetness of dried cod waiting in open barrels, the human smell of men who have worked since before dawn. You close the shutter against this intrusion, returning to your counting table and the cold rim of the pewter cup as you finish the thin wine. The Hanseatic colours were white and red, still visible in many Hanseatic city coats of arms, and you find yourself imagining those colours on the banner of a cog making the spring passage to Lübeck, the white and red bright against the grey Baltic sky, though you know such imagination is the luxury of a man who has risen too early and drunk too little. The scratch of goose quill marks the final calculation, the exchange rates for the coming Flemish cloth purchase against your Lübeck credit, now resolved into a single figure that you copy twice, once into your ledger, and once onto the slip of paper that will accompany your bid. You will send this bid by cog, if the wind serves, or overland through the customs posts of the Rhine if it does not. The choice itself, a calculation of cost and time, and the particular risks of each season. You have walked in the great buildings of Hanseatic cities, have sat in the halls where the weight of mercantile wealth was converted into political voice. The Hanse are an important factor, not only economically, but also politically and culturally, as you witnessed in assemblies where merchants spoke as princes and were answered in kind. You straighten from your work, feeling in your shoulders the stiffness of a man born around 1370, probably in Westphalia, died in July 1426 in Lübeck, though this death is still 7 years distant and unimaginable on this March morning in the counting house at first light. The servant returns, silent as before, to remove the empty cup and the crumbs of bread, and you note in passing that the young man's hands are chapped from the kitchen water, the skin cracked at the knuckles. You make no comment, offer no remedy, for such observations are not the business of merchants, yet the image stays with you as you turn to the chest of correspondence, searching among the sealed packets for the particular letter of credit you will need before the cloth merchants arrive. The floorboards creak under your knees, the wood swollen with the damp of the canal, and the grey-green light filtering through horn-paned windows shows you the dust motes rising from the disturbed papers, each particle visible and slow in the thickened air of the counting house. The distant clatter of wooden shoes on cobblestones has changed its rhythm now, the labourers pausing in their work as the official hours begin, the quay entering that period of relative stillness that separates the preparations of dawn from the transactions of the proper day. You find the letter you seek, break its seal with a practiced motion, and compare its terms against your own calculation, the 2 columns of figures meeting in agreement that satisfies without surprising. The Hanseatic League has created the conditions for such agreement, the standard forms and recognized procedures that allow a man in Bruges to extend credit against the promise of a man in Bergen, though neither has seen the other's face in years. You feel the absence of the pewter cup's warmth, the internal chill that comes from early rising and insufficient breaking of fast. You will eat properly at the communal dinner, the midday meal that gathers the merchants of the Kontor in the hall below. But that lies hours distant, and the figures on your page seem to shift slightly in your vision, demanding the concentration that fatigue would steal. You remind yourself of the distinction between your own position and that of any mere trader with a pack horse and a route, anchoring your thoughts in the particular structure of the steadyhands as your attention wavers. The scratch of goose quill on heavy paper begins again, a letter to your son in Lübeck, the free and Hanseatic city of Hamburg's northern counterpart in the Baltic trade. Hamburg's official name, Free and Hanseatic City of Hamburg, refers to its history as a free imperial city and member of the Hanseatic League, and you use the full dignity of that name in your address, the formality of the opening matching the weight of what you will communicate. The cloth purchase negotiated, the Borgen cargo expected, the spring convoy prepared for sailing when the ice permits. In the careful construction of this letter, you participate in the importance of the Hansa, your words traveling the same routes as your goods, carrying the same authority of established practice and mutual recognition. The grey-green light filtering through horn-paned windows warms toward something nearer yellow as the sun rises above the mist, the day promising clear skies after the damp of the March night. You write on, your hand moving through the forms that have become automatic, the greetings and assurances, and the particular coded phrases that indicate to an informed reader what cannot be written plainly. Bruges was one of the centres of textile industry and long-distance trade in late medieval Europe, and thus one of the birthplaces of early capitalism. And in this room above its canal, you practice the capitalism of your age, the extension of credit against future production, the speculation on prices and seasons, and the reliability of distant correspondence. The smell of tallow and beeswax has entirely dissipated now, replaced by the ordinary smells of a working day, the kitchen fires below, and the ink on your fingers, and the particular mustiness of correspondence stored too long in chests. You seal your letter with the mark you share with your brother Sivert, the Veckentusen device that identifies your communications across the network of your trade, and set it aside for the packet that will leave with the afternoon tide. You will see the symbol of the Hansa in the vessel that carries your words north, the high-sided hull and the single square sail of the cog that have become as familiar to you as the faces of your own household. The distant clatter of wooden shoes on cobblestones resumes, the labourers return to their work, and you know from the changed sound that the cloth merchants have arrived at the lower door, their own wooden shoes distinct from the labourers in their heavier tread and the confidence of their pace. You have time yet, time to review your figures once more, to ensure that the exchange rates for the coming Flemish cloth purchase against your Lübeck credit are calculated to the last pfennig, that your offer will be neither so generous as to invite suspicion nor so strict as to drive the merchants to another buyer. You touch the small seal on your letter, as if touching the white and red of the Hanseatic colours, drawing from them the steadiness that the coming negotiation will require. The floorboards creak as you stand, the wood swollen with the damp of the canal, and you move to the small mirror that hangs beside the door, examining your face with the detachment that long practice has taught you. A man born around 1370, probably in Westphalia, died in July 1426 in Lübeck, carries the marks of his years and his travels, and you see in your reflection the grey that has overtaken your beard, the lines that the counting house at first light has etched beside your eyes. This face, this moment of self-regard, will leave no trace in the record you and Sivert left behind, yet it exists, has existed, in the grey-green mornings of 1,000 calculations. Nearly 200 sea and inland cities of northern Europe were joined in the Hanseatic League at its greatest extent. And in this moment, you represent them all, speak with the weight of their collective practice, their accumulated wisdom, and their shared interest in the free movement of goods across the distances that separate Bruges from Bergen, the Rhine from the Baltic. The scratch of goose quill on heavy paper has ceased. The ledger lies closed upon the counting table, the letter sealed, the figures resolved into the single position from which you will negotiate. The grey-green light, filtering through horn-paned windows, has become the ordinary light of morning. The mist burned away, the city of Bruges fully visible in its wealth and its activity. Under Burgundian rule, Bruges became one of the economically and culturally richest cities in Europe. And you, descending the stair, feel that richness in the carved newel post beneath your hand, the Flemish tapestry hung in the lower hall, the very smell of prosperity that rises to meet you from the chamber where the cloth merchants stand with their samples spread upon the long table. You examine the first sample, feeling the weight of the Flemish weave between your fingers, noting the regularity of the warp and weft that indicates proper manufacture. German as an independent language can be traced since the 8th century, developing into numerous dialects, and you speak now in the Low German that serves as a commercial tongue of the Hanse. Your words perhaps understood by Flemish merchants who may have learned this language of trade, if not the political language of their Burgundian court. The cog became the symbol of the Hanse due to the development of maritime transport, and the delivery date you propose assumes such transport, the spring conve, that will carry these cloths north before the summer storms make the passage hazardous. The negotiation continues through the morning hours, the cold of the counting house at first light forgotten in the warmth of the lower chamber, the fire built up against the lingering damp. Many Hanseatic cities achieved great wealth through free trade, evidenced by numerous significant buildings, and you feel that wealth in your own person now, the confidence that comes from representing not merely your own capital, but the accumulated credit of your name, your family, the network of obligation and trust that extends from this room in Bruges to the warehouses of Lübeck, to the Bergen wharves where your dried fish and train oil await shipment, to the nearly 300 sea and inland cities of northern Europe that constitute the Hanseatic League at its greatest extent. The cloth merchants respond with their own precision, their counters sliding beads across frames as they calculate the cost of their own production, the profit they must realize, the risks they assume in extending credit against future delivery. The Hanseatic League appears to have developed from a Kaufmannschanz to a Städtehanse by the mid-14th century, with early general Hansetages held around this time, and scholars suggest that the forms of this negotiation may descend from those assemblies, which established standardized procedures that helped prevent individual transactions from becoming matters of personal dispute and elevated trade to a more recognized practice. You know these forms as you know your own ledger, move through them with the ease of long repetition, and the morning progresses toward agreement with the inevitability that such forms, properly observed, tend to produce. The distant clatter of wooden shoes on cobblestones fades from your attention, the sounds of the key becoming mere background to the concentrated exchange of the counting house. The floorboards here do not creak as those above, better maintained for the reception of merchants, the wood less swollen with the damp of the canal, though the same canal runs beneath the same walls. The smell of the merchant's own exertion has replaced the tallow and beeswax of the morning, the human warmth of bodies gathered in negotiation, the particular scent of wool samples handled and debated. You note these sensations even as your attention remains upon the figures, the terms, the careful construction of an agreement that will bind you and your brother Sivert, and your correspondence across the months between this March morning and the autumn reckoning when the profits, if profits there be, will be calculated and distributed. You sip, offer the expected praise of the vintage, though your palate detects nothing remarkable, the wine serving function rather than pleasure in this context. You find yourself observing the merchant's clothing for the white and red of the Hanseatic colors, finding them in the trim of a sleeve, the binding of a purse, the small signals of shared affiliation that persist even in this Burgundian city, where the Hansa operates by privilege rather than sovereignty. The scratch of goose quill on heavy paper marks the final stage, the agreement reduced to writing, the copies made for each party. The signatures and seals are fixed in the forms that will make this document enforceable across jurisdictions. You write your name with the same care you brought to your morning calculations, the same attention to the weight of each letter, and attach the Weckenhusen seal beside your brother's mark, the joint signature that represents your partnership. The grey-green light of the upper chamber has long since passed into the full brightness of midday, and in the lower hall the servants are already preparing the communal table for the dinner that will gather the Kontor's residents in the hour to come. You gather your copy of the agreement, place it with your other papers for later transcription into the ledger, and move toward the door with the measured pace that your age and your dignity require. The floorboards creak slightly as you turn, the wood still holding some damp from the canal, and you find yourself for a moment disoriented, the morning's concentration leaving you in a rush that reveals the fatigue beneath your sustained attention. You are Hildebrand Weckenhusen, a merchant born around 1370, probably in Westphalia, who died in 1426 in Lübeck. And in this moment between the completion of one task and the commencement of another, you feel the full weight of that identity, the years of early rising and careful calculation, the accumulated responsibility of extensive correspondence and account books, the network of expectation that connects you to the trading cities of Northern Europe, joined in the Hanseatic League at its greatest extent. The distant clatter of wooden shoes on cobblestones has become the ordinary sound of a city at work, no longer the signal of dawn, but merely the background of continuous activity. You move toward the stair, your hand upon the carved rail, your feet finding the familiar risers in the dim light of the passage. You descend slowly, each step deliberate, the fatigue of your waking hours settling into your shoulders, your knees, the small joints of your fingers that have gripped the goose quill through the morning's long inscription. The warmth of the negotiated wine seems distant memory, already fading into the larger warmth of the lower hall, where fire and bodies and the approach of dinner create their own climate. You emerge from the stair into the gathering of merchants there. Coats and furs forming a wall of scent and texture through which you must pass to reach the outer door. The afternoon has turned toward evening without your notice, and the light falling through the high windows of the merchant hall carries that particular pale gold of a Flemish winter sky. The sun already descending toward the flat horizon, beyond the canals, called Rijn by those who have lived here long enough to remember the medieval river that once flowed unhindered to the North Sea. You are standing now in the doorway as Weckenhusen passes through, and the cold air moves across your face with the sharpness of a blade newly whetted, carrying with it the first intimations of the quayside that lies beyond the merchant quarter. Around you, the narrow streets of Bruges descend toward the water, the cobbles worn smooth by centuries of cart wheels and the passage of feet in every kind of weather, their surfaces gleaming where the afternoon's brief rain has left its residue. The buildings lean toward one another across these passages, as if whispering secrets of cargo and price, and the fortunes of men who rise and fall with the tide of trade, their gabled facades marked with the symbols of guilds and individual merchants, whose names repeat through the correspondence that fills the counting houses. Veckenhusen walks with the deliberate pace of a man who has learned to measure his energy through long days of negotiation, his boots finding familiar purchase on stones that have supported generations of Hanseatic traders before him. The harbour at Bruges, you understand, does not open directly to the sea as the harbours of Lübeck or Bergen open to their waters, but connects instead through the port of Zeebrugge approximately 14 kilometres to the north, a passage of canals and controlled water that shapes the rhythm of arrival and departure with which every merchant must contend. The light continues its slow fade toward evening as you descend with Veckenhusen toward the quayside, and the first sounds of the waterfront reach your ears before the full scene reveals itself. The slap of water against hull timbers black, with tar establishing itself as the foundational rhythm beneath all other activity. A cog from Lübeck has tied up overnight, its high sides rising above the quay like a wooden fortress brought to rest against the stone, its single mast bare now of sail, and reaching upward into the darkening sky with the patient verticality of a thing designed for function rather than beauty, though beauty resides in its proportions nonetheless. The cog, with its high sides and single mast, became a characteristic Hanseatic trading vessel and symbol of the League, and its presence here in the harbour of Bruges speaks of the web of connection that stretches from this quay to the Baltic, to the North Sea, to distant waters where dried cod and salted herring were loaded for European trade, that continued from the medieval period onward as foodstuffs upon which expanding populations depended. Veckenhusen descends the final slope of the approach and steps onto the quay itself, his presence noted by those who have learned to recognize the merchants whose goods they handle, whose marks upon barrels determine the destination of cargoes and the wages of those who move them. Around you, the quays of Bruges reveal themselves in their full complexity, lined with cranes operated by treadwheels for unloading heavy goods, the wooden structures rising at intervals along the waterfront with their arms extended over the water like mechanical giants, frozen in attitudes of perpetual reaching. The groan of wooden crane treadwheels reaches your ears as men walk their weight upward in the circular motion that lifts cargo from hold to quay, their bodies leaning into the labour with the coordinated patience of those who understand that haste costs more than time in the handling of another man's property. The cog from Lübeck rides at its moorings with the slight motion of a living thing, the water beneath its hull disturbed by the activity of unloading that has continued through the day and shows no sign of ceasing with the approach of darkness. You are standing near enough to observe the individual barrels as they emerge from the hold, their curved forms wrapped in the shadows of the ship's interior before catching the last light on the quay, and you notice the marks upon them that identify their ownership, their destination, their content. The barrels were the standard container for herring, fish, wine, and other commodities, with specific sizes regulated by town ordinances that sought to prevent the fraud and dispute that arise when measurement becomes a matter of individual interpretation. Veckenhusen moves along the quay with the unhurried attention of a man who has learned that presence prevents more loss than any subsequent legal action can recover, his eyes finding among the emerging cargo the particular mark of his brother's merchant house, the symbol that repeats through the correspondence they maintain across the distances that separate their operations. The process of salting and preserving fish involved brining, called perkeln in the documents that pass between them, with salt and saltpeter to prevent spoilage, and the barrels that bear his brother's mark contain the results of this process. The herring and cod that have made their slow journey from the Baltic fisheries to this Flemish quay where European appetite awaits. The cold air moves across your face with a persistence that seems to carry the memory of northern waters, and with it comes the reek of fermented herring, brine from a cracked barrel that some mishandling has damaged, the contents seeping across the stone to mingle with the other effluvia of the quayside. The smell of fish, tar, and river mud characterized Hanseatic quaysides across northern Europe, and you find in this particular combination of odors the confirmation that you have arrived at the center of a commerce that transcends the local, that binds distant shores in mutual dependence. The coarse cry of gulls overhead reaches you, the birds circling for fish scraps with the opportunistic patience of creatures who have learned that human activity produces reliable waste. Veckentusen pauses beside a stack of barrels that bear his brother's mark, his fingers finding the chalk in his pocket with the automatic gesture of a man who has performed this ritual countless times, and you observe the care with which he examines each container for signs of leakage, for the integrity of the seal, for the mark that confirms its origin and intended destination. Hanseatic merchants in Bruges dealt in goods such as Flemish cloth, Russian wax, Norwegian dried fish, and Baltic grain, and the diversity of this trade would have required attention to the specific qualities of these commodities. The light has faded now to that condition of half-visibility in which torches and lanterns begin to assert their presence against the encroaching dark, and the quayside transforms under this altered illumination into a scene of moving shadows and sudden concentrations of brightness, where the work continues without reference to the sun's departure. You are standing near a lantern that has been hung from a crane arm, and in its pool of yellow illumination, you observe a Flemish inspector at work upon a bolt of cloth that has been brought from a nearby warehouse for examination. The quality inspection of cloth involved measuring length, width, and examining weave density by touch and candlelight, and this man performs his function with the absorbed concentration of one who knows that his judgment determines acceptance or dispute, payment or delay. The rough texture of Flemish broadcloth between thumb and forefinger is a sensation that Veckentusen has learned to read, as another man reads script, and you watch as he joins the inspector at the measuring frame, his own fingers finding the fabric's character, while the official L-stick is applied to determine whether the bolt meets the standard upon which their agreement depends. Standardized weights and measures were crucial to Hanseatic trade, and disputes over measurement were common and recorded in merchant correspondence with the weary regularity of a problem that no system has yet solved to universal satisfaction. The cold iron of the measuring L lies smooth from generations of use, its edges rounded by the passage of countless cloth bolts and the hands that have held it in positions of judgment. Veckentusen and the inspector exchange the brief remarks that professional recognition permits, their words falling into the larger soundscape of the quayside without rising to the level of contention. For the moment, though you sense the reservation in each man's posture, the slight withholding that precedes the harder negotiation when measurement fails to satisfy. The cog from Lübeck continues its slow surrender of cargo in the background, the groan of wooden crane treadwheels persisting as men walk their weight upward in the eternal circle of their labor, their bodies becoming machines of transfer, of translation from hold to quay, from sea to land, from one system of value to another. The night has established itself fully now, and the stars that appear above the harbor carry the particular clarity of cold air over water, their light competing with the torches below to create a layered illumination in which figures move with the incomplete definition of a dream. You are standing near enough to observe Veckentusen as he moves among the accumulated goods, his chalk marking accepted barrels with the decisive strokes of a man who has learned to commit himself in writing before doubt can intervene. And you notice the small book that emerges from his coat, the pocket ledger in which quantities find their permanent record against the forgetfulness that time and fatigue impose upon even the most diligent memory. The reek of fermented herring brine from a cracked barrel has diminished as the damaged container was removed, but its ghost persists in the larger olfactory landscape of the quayside, mingling with the fresher sense of tar and wood and the particular mustiness of cloth stored too long in damp conditions. The coarse cry of gulls overhead has diminished with the darkness, the birds having found their roosts or followed the last light toward other harbours, where the fishing fleets provide more reliable sustenance. Yet the sound persists in memory as you stand beside Veckentusen in the accumulating night, the slap of water against hull timbers black, with tar continuing its unhurried rhythm against the stone of the quay. A shipmaster approaches from the direction of the cog, his gait suggesting the rolling adjustment of a man whose body has learned the motion of decks, and now translates even stable ground into the memory of waves. Veckentusen turns to meet him with the slight straightening that precedes any negotiation, his body assuming the posture of attention that merchant correspondence requires, the stance of a man who must be present to his interests, because no proxy can fully substitute for the judgment of the principal. They exchange the forms of greeting that the Hanseatic world has established across its far-flung stations, the recognition of shared affiliation that does not preclude the sharper contention of particular dispute. The matter, you gather from their postures and the gestures that accompany their words, concerns a short measure, a discrepancy between the quantity recorded in the ship's papers and the quantity that has emerged from the hold onto the quayside of Bruges. Veckentusen disputes the short measure with the shipmaster, both men consulting the written charter party that governs their agreement, the document that exists precisely for this moment of divergence, this necessity of appeal to words fixed in ink when the fluidity of circumstance produces conflict. The cold air moves across your face as you observe their consultation, the parchment held between them in the torchlight, with the vulnerability of all human arrangements that seek to bind the future to the present's intention. The charter party records the terms upon which they agreed in Lübeck, in the counting house where the voyage was conceived and its conditions established, and now in Bruges, in the darkness of an unloading that has revealed the gap between promise and performance, they must return to those terms as men return to Scripture in search of guidance for present perplexity. Veckentusen's finger finds the relevant clause with the precision of long practice, and you observe the shipmaster's face in the torchlight as he follows the gesture, his expression shifting through the recognizable phases of acknowledgement and resistance, the negotiation between what is written and what is wished that constitutes the daily texture of commercial life. The cog from Lübeck has become the scene of this particular drama, its hold now largely emptied of the cargo that occasioned the voyage, its purpose nearing completion even as the final accounting remains unresolved. The groan of wooden crane treadwheels reaches you again from farther down the quay, where another vessel receives the attention of the night crew, the work of unloading continuing through the hours of darkness, because the tide and the schedule permit no delay, because the canals called Rhein must serve the commerce that passes through them without regard for the convenience of human rest. You are standing now at a slight distance from the disputants, your position allowing observation without involvement, the role that the narrative permits for one who has descended with Veckentusen to this quayside, without possessing the standing to intervene. The shipmaster makes a gesture of concession, or of temporary suspension, his hand moving across the charter party in a motion that seems to seek some middle ground between absolute claims, and Veckentusen responds with a slight relaxation that indicates his own willingness to find resolution rather than prolong contention. They will return to this matter, you understand, in the fuller light of morning, with additional witnesses, and perhaps the intervention of the local authorities who regulate the trade of Bruges. But for the present, they achieve a provisional peace that permits the work to continue, the unloading to proceed toward its completion. The barrels that bear his brother's mark stand in their ordered ranks upon the quay, awaiting the final chalk marks that will determine their disposition, their movement from this temporary resting place to the warehouses and markets that constitute their further destination. Veckentusen moves among them, now with the lantern he has borrowed from a passing worker, its light falling upon each container in turn as he verifies what earlier examination suggested, the integrity of seal and stave, the legibility of mark and measure. The barrel's very ubiquity makes their proper management essential to the trust upon which long-distance trade depends. You observe the chalk in his hand as it moves across the curved surface of a barrel that meets his standard, the mark of acceptance that will permit its transfer to his control. Its incorporation into the inventory he maintains with the meticulous attention that merchant correspondence reveals and demands. The pocket ledger emerges again, and in the lantern light you glimpse the columns of his record, the quantities and qualities and prices that transform physical objects into entries in a system of account, the translation from material to numerical that constitutes the merchant's particular art. The cold iron of the measuring ell has been returned to its place, but its smooth surface persists in memory as you stand beside Veckentusen in the completion of his task, the generations of use that have shaped it into an instrument of reliable judgment. Hanseatic merchants often employed local porters and stevedores under strict supervision to prevent theft, and you observe now the presence of these workers in the shadows beyond the immediate circle of Veckentusen's attention, their movements governed by the supervision of overseers who know that the darkness of night and the confusion of unloading create opportunity for the appropriation of small quantities. The slow hemorrhage of profit that accumulated loss transforms into significant damage. The porters carry train oil in sealed casks, their bodies bent under the weight of this commodity that moves in smaller quantities than the barrels of preserved fish, but with no less importance to the industries that await it. The smell of the train oil reaches you as the porters pass, penetrating the morning air that has begun to replace the night with the first intimations of grey in the eastern sky above the harbour. This particular addition completes the sensory signature of this place, this moment, this convergence of northern commerce upon the canals of Bruges that connect to the sea via Zeebrugge, approximately 14 kilometers to the north. The cold air moves across your face with the freshness of approaching dawn, the transition between night and day that brings with it the resumption of full activity, the arrival of inspectors and merchants, and the officials who regulate the flow of goods through this essential node of trade. Veckentusen completes his final marks, the chalk moving with the decisiveness of a man who has reached the end of a long process and seeks now the closure that permits rest, that restores to him the hours of his own that the night's vigilance has consumed. The cog from Lübeck will remain at its moorings through the coming day, its crew attending to the maintenance that the voyage requires, the repairs and replacements that prepare it for its return to the Baltic, for the next cycle of loading and departure, and the slow passage through the waters that connect the ports of the League in their web of mutual dependence. You are standing at the quayside as the first full light begins to define the edges of things, the harbour revealing itself in the clarity of morning with the details that darkness obscured, the particular colours of water and wood, and the stone of the quay that supports the commerce of centuries. The slap of water against hull timbers black with tar continues its unhurried rhythm, but now in the fuller context of a world becoming visible, the activity of gulls resuming overhead with the coarse cry of their circling for fish scraps, the renewal of appetite that each day brings. Veckenhusen closes his pocket ledger with the finality of a man who has completed the record that memory and law require, his body showing now in its posture the fatigue that sustained attention has held at bay through the hours of darkness. The quayside of Bruges extends around you in its full complexity, the cranes with their treadwheels awaiting the day's labour, the warehouses receiving their night's accumulation of goods, the canals called Rhein flowing with the controlled movement that human engineering has imposed upon natural water. The presence of commodities in their various states of arrival and departure creates the particular atmosphere of this place, the density of value in transit that distinguishes the quayside from the quieter precincts of the city that lies beyond the harbour. You observe Veckenhusen as he turns from his completed task toward the ascent that will return him to the merchant quarter, his figure diminishing against the rising light as he moves from the water toward the streets that lead eventually to the hall where the fire and the bodies and the approach of another day's business create their own climate of human endeavour. The cog from Lübeck remains at its moorings, its high sides rising with the patient solidity of the vessel that has become the characteristic Hanseatic trading vessel and symbol of the League, its single mast reaching toward the brightening sky with the vertical assertion of a technology that has proven its adequacy through centuries of use. The groan of wooden crane treadwheels resumes as the day crew replaces the night workers, men walking their weight upward in the eternal circle that lifts cargo from hold to quay, that translates the products of distant fields and fisheries into the mobile wealth upon which the merchant's calculation depends. The reek of fermented herring brine has dispersed into the larger atmosphere of the quayside, its particular intensity absorbed into the general smell of fish, tar and river mud that characterized Hanseatic quaysides across northern Europe, the signature odor of a commerce that dealt in dried cod and salted herring from the medieval period onward as European-wide foodstuffs that developed the process of salting and preserving fish through brining, through perkeln with salt and saltpeter to prevent spoilage, that brought these products to this quay in Bruges, where the canals called Rhein preserve the memory of the medieval river Rhei that flowed directly to the North Sea. You remain standing as Veckenhusen's figure disappears into the ascending streets, your position upon the quay permitting the continued observation of a scene that will persist beyond his departure, beyond your own eventual movement, the eternal present of commerce that renews itself with each tide and each vessel's arrival. These sensations accumulate into the particular consciousness of the quayside, the knowledge that comes from presence and attention, and the willingness to stand in the cold, and the smell, and the persistent sound of water against wood, while the commerce of the Hanseatic world unfolds in its ancient patterns of trust and verification, of dispute and provisional resolution, of the chalk mark and the pocket ledger and the written charter party, that binds distant men to mutual obligation. The barrels that bear Veckentusen's brother's mark stand in their ranks upon the quay, awaiting the further disposition that his chalk has authorized, their contents secured by the process of brining, by perkeln with salt and saltpeter, their journey from the Baltic fisheries to this Flemish harbour accomplished in the hold of the cog from Lübeck, the vessel with its high sides and single mast that became the characteristic Hanseatic trading vessel and symbol of the League. The standard size is regulated by town ordinances, the specific measures that prevent the fraud of short quantity, the disputes over measurement, recorded in merchant correspondence with the weary persistence of a problem that attends all human transaction. These form the invisible structure within which the visible activity proceeds. You are standing at the quayside as the morning advances, the light strengthening across the water and the stone, the harbour of Bruges revealing itself in its full extent as a place of connection, of translation between the sea and the land, between the port of Zeebrugge, approximately 14 kilometres to the north, and the markets of the interior toward which the canals called Rhine direct their controlled flow. The diversity of trade in Flemish cloth, Russian wax, Norwegian dried fish, and Baltic grain creates the particular density of the quayside, the accumulation of commodities, and the men who move them, and the merchants who claim ownership, and the inspectors who verify quality, and the officials who record and tax and regulate. The porters move under their strict supervision, their bodies bearing the train oil in sealed casks, the smell penetrating the morning air with its particular insistence, the Hanseatic merchants' employment of local labour under conditions of vigilance that seek to prevent the theft that opportunity and poverty so often generate. The cranes operated by treadwheels for unloading heavy goods continue their function through the advancing morning, their wooden structures rising at intervals along the waterfront with their arms extended over the water like mechanical giants, frozen in attitudes of perpetual reaching. The groan of their operation reaching your ears as men walk their weight upward in the circular motion that lifts cargo from hold to quay. Their bodies leaning into the labour with the coordinated patience of those who understand that haste costs more than time in the handling of another man's property. The noon bell of the nearby church of Our Lady carries across the canals of Bruges, its bronze voice falling upon the tiled roofs and the narrow streets that lead toward the Hanseatic Kontor. You are standing in the passage that connects the warehouse court to the Communal hall, where the merchants of the Hansa have already begun to assemble. The stone floor beneath your feet carries the residue of morning trade, thin streaks of wax and scattered grains that the hall servants have not yet swept away. Around you, the merchants adjust their heavy cloaks and move toward the carved doorway, their conversation dropping to the subdued murmur that the rules of the Kontor demand at meal times. The hall opens before you in a long rectangle of timber and plaster, its ceiling lost in the upward drift of smoke from the central hearth where beechwood and green oaks smoulder with a steady, familiar persistence. The smoke curls through the rafters, lending its particular fragrance to the enclosed air, and you feel the sting of it gathering at the corners of your eyes as you step across the threshold. Rushlights flicker in iron sconces along the plastered walls, casting long shadows that sway and settle with each movement of the body or passage of air through the high windows. The weight of oak benches greets your hands as you find your place, the wood polished by wool and use to a surface that retains the warmth of previous occupants. Generations of Hanseatic merchants who have sat in this same hall to observe the same customs. Veckentusen takes his place at the long oak table, his seniority granting him a position near the centre, and you observe the quiet satisfaction with which he settles onto the bench that custom reserves for men of his standing. The Bergen Kontor, that Tisk Briggen, and the London Kontor, the Stiliad, are the best documented of these establishments, though Bruges was equally significant in the woven network of Hanseatic trade, and the privileges enjoyed here mirror those claimed in those northern and western outposts. The table stretches before you, its boards dark with age and scrubbing, marked with the knife scars and ink spots of countless negotiations conducted over bread and ale. The Hanseatic Kontor in Bruges, like those in Bergen, London, and Novgorod, enforced strict rules on resident merchants, and nowhere do these rules find more daily expression than in the ritual of this communal meal. The steam rising from communal pottage, barley thick with dried peas, reaches you now as the servants bear the great vessels from the kitchen passage, their wooden ladles clicking against the iron rims. It carries with it the scent of salt pork and the faint bitterness of herbs gathered from the monastery gardens beyond the city walls, a smell that identifies the noon hour across every contour of the Hanseatic League. You watch as the elected stewards move along the table, their eyes assessing the quality of what is served, for it is their responsibility to ensure that no merchant receives better provision than another, that the communal account is not defrauded by a grasping cook or a dishonest purveyor. The sharp edge of small beer, soured slightly from the cask, follows the pottage in earthenware jacks, and you taste the fermentation that speaks of careful brewing and adequate storage, the cellar master's competence measured in this daily provision. A young merchant from Hamburg is reprimanded for speaking too familiarly with a Flemish serving woman, and the silence that falls upon that section of the table draws your attention from your own portion. The alderman who delivers the rebuke does not raise his voice, for the rules of the Kontor prescribe dignity in correction as in all things, yet the words carry the weight of statutes drafted in Lübeck and affirmed in the Bergen Kontor and the London Kontor alike. Kontor regulations typically forbade marriage to local women, requiring merchants to maintain ties to their home cities, and the prohibition extends to any familiarity that might compromise the merchant's primary allegiance or embroil the community in disputes with local families. You observe the young man's color rise and subside as he accepts the reprimand, his brief nod of acknowledgement the only response permitted, for quarrelling with authority constitutes a separate offence under the ordinances that govern this hall. The murmur of low German dialects, the common tongue of the Hansa, resumes as the incident concludes, the merchants returning to their pottage and their measured conversation. It blends with the crackle of the fire and the clink of spoons against wooden bowls, a soundscape that would be instantly recognizable to any merchant dining simultaneously in the Stiliad or the Tisk Briggen. You are standing at the threshold of this acoustic world, the particular cadences of Wendish and Saxon varieties mingling with the coastal inflections of those who have come from the Western Kontor, and the familiarity of it wraps around you like the smoke that continues to drift from the central hearth. The alderman reads notices after the final scraps have been gathered, his voice carrying the formal authority of his elected position. The Kontor elected its own aldermen, Eltermänner, to administer justice and negotiate with local authorities, and this function of public address belongs to the office as surely as the adjudication of disputes or the sealing of agreements. New restrictions on English cloth imports feature among the announcements, the protection of Hanseatic textile interests requiring constant vigilance against the competition that flows across the narrow sea. A warning about counterfeit Lübeck coin follows, The integrity of the monetary system upon which all trade depends threatened by the clever forgeries that circulate in the marketplaces of every port. You note the stillness with which these announcements are received, the merchants understanding that their collective prosperity rests upon such shared intelligence and coordinated response. After the meal, merchants gather by the hearth to hear letters read aloud from other Kontor, and you find yourself among those who press toward the warmth as the afternoon light weakens in the high windows. The written word travels by the same ships that carry their goods, the information it contains as vital to their operations as any cargo. The Bergen Kontor sends word of the herring season and the prices obtained for train oil in the northern markets. The London Kontor reports on the negotiations with the English Crown and the status of the Fungeld collections that support their shared operations. Bruges was equally significant in this correspondence, its own reports destined for the aldermen's desks in those distant halls, the reciprocity of information binding the League across the maritime distances that separate its outposts. The smoke of the hall fire continues its slow ascent as the letters are read, mingling with the damp wool of cloaks hung to dry upon the screen that shields the outer door. You feel the heat upon your face, the contrast with the cooler air of the hall's periphery, and you understand why the hearth becomes the natural center of Kontor life in these winter months when the Flemish canals carry ice and the Baltic is closed to navigation. The weight of oak benches supports those who have drawn near to listen, the same benches that will serve for the evening meal and for any judicial proceedings that the aldermen may schedule. The flicker of rushlights in wall sconces grows more pronounced as the afternoon advances, competing with the grey light that filters through the horn panes of the upper windows. You observe the play of illumination upon the carved beams of the ceiling, the decorative elements that proclaim the prosperity of this establishment and the pride of the cities that maintain it. The regularity of this daily round, the predictability of its rituals and their temporal markers, constitutes one of the most effective instruments of enforcement, the merchant who lives by such a schedule finding little opportunity for the deviations that the ordinances prohibit. Night curfews were enforced, and the knowledge of this approaching boundary colors the latter part of the afternoon's gathering. Merchants found outside the Kontor precinct, after hours facing penalties, that the communal account books record with meticulous impartiality. You sense the subtle shift in posture among those around you, the unhurried preparation for departure that must conclude before the appointed hour, the calculation of remaining time that governs their movements. The Kontor maintained its own seal, treasury, and legal jurisdiction over Hanseatic members, and the power to enforce such curfews derived from this autonomous status, the local authorities of Bruges acknowledging the League's right to govern its own members according to its own statutes. Gambling, excessive drinking, and quarrelling with locals were specifically prohibited in most Kontor ordinances, the enumeration of these offences suggesting their persistent attraction, the difficulty of maintaining discipline among men separated from the social constraints of their home communities. The small beer has been consumed in measured quantities throughout the meal, the steward's observation ensuring that no individual exceeds the bounds of moderation that the rules prescribe. You have noted the absence of dice or cards in this hall, the absence of any gaming equipment that might tempt the idle or the anxious. The Kontor buildings, typically including warehouses, living quarters, a counting house, and a communal dining hall, but no provision for the recreations that other establishments might tolerate. Merchants were required to attend religious services together, typically at a designated Hanseatic chapel or church, and the approaching evening will see them assemble for vespers at the altar that their collective devotion maintains. You observe the merchants making their preparations, the adjustment of garments that this transition demands, the mental shift from commercial to spiritual concerns that the schedule of their day imposes. These same aldermen will lead the procession to worship, their precedents established by the same criteria of seniority and wealth that govern the seating at table. The steam of the pottage has long since dissipated, the vessels return to the kitchen for scouring, the residue of the meal erased from the boards by the servants' efficient labor. It leaves only the memory of its nourishment and the settled warmth of satisfied appetite, the physical foundation upon which the afternoon's commercial deliberations rest. You remain by the hearth as the hall empties, the merchants dispersing to their counting houses or their warehouses, to the examination of cargoes or the drafting of correspondence that will be read aloud in similar halls across the network of the League. Merchants paid a fungeld, pound money, on goods traded to support Kontor expenses, and the collection of this levy, the recording of its receipts in the communal account books, constitutes one of the aldermen's most regular responsibilities. You have observed the chest in which these sums are secured, the multiple locks that require the keys of several officers to open, the procedural safeguards that protect the collective treasury from any individual's temptation. Fines for violations of Kontor rules were recorded in the communal account books and could be substantial. The young Hamburg merchant's infraction of the morning likely to appear among the entries for this month, the diminishing of his standing measured in the currency that the League employs for such penalties. The murmur of low German dialects has faded to isolated exchanges as the hall clears, giving way to the more intimate conversations of those who remain to complete some private arrangement before the curfew compels their separation. You are standing at the window that overlooks the warehouse court, where the last light reveals the outlines of cranes and the stacked barrels that await tomorrow's inspection. The scene before you might be duplicated in those northern halls with only the variation of landscape and climate to distinguish them. The rushlights become the primary illumination as the dusk deepens, creating a domestic intimacy among those who remain. You feel the day's commerce settling into record and memory, the transactions of the morning finding their place in the ledgers that will be examined by the stewards and approved by the aldermen. The oak benches receive the weight of a single merchant who has fallen asleep by the fire. His exhaustion forgiven in this hour before the curfew bell demands his removal to the dormitory above. The small beer lingers upon your own palate, the taste associated now with this particular chamber and its particular customs, the sensory marker of a belonging that transcends the individual merchant's origin. The absence of women in this hall, save the serving folk who move with proper deference and proper distance, reinforces the temporary nature of this residence, the sojourner's status that defines the Hanseatic merchant abroad. You understand the loneliness that such regulations might engender, the compensatory intensity of the communal bonds that the Kontor structures and demands. The smoke of the hall fire has begun to thin as the fresh fuel of the afternoon exhausts its volatile oils, giving way to the deeper glow of charcoal that will sustain the heat until the morning's rekindling. You watch the embers settle and shift, the occasional spark ascending toward the blackened throat of the chimney, the ancient dance of combustion that warms this space and every similar space across the League's territories. The evening's quiet compliance with curfew, the orderly retirement to the sleeping quarters, the silence that will fall upon this court until the dawn bell, constitutes the final expression of enforcement, the merchant's body governed as surely as his trade. The alderman passes through on his final inspection, his presence requiring no announcement, the authority of his office manifest in his bearing and in the merchant's automatic deference. The trust reposed in this particular man, his proven judgment in the disputes that have arisen, his diplomatic skill in the conferences with the city magistrates, ensures the continuation of this system across the generations. You observe the quiet exchange between him and the sleeping merchant, the hand upon the shoulder that rouses without humiliation, the direction toward the stair that leads to the dormitory where the others have already retired. The final bell that marks curfew commencement has begun its distant ringing, the sound that merchants found outside the Kontor precinct after hours faced penalties for ignoring. You move toward the passage through which you entered, your steps echoing upon the stone as the servants make their last preparations for the morrow. The raking of ashes, the laying of fresh fuel, the arrangement of benches in their proper order for the next communal meal. You pass through each of these functions in your progress toward the gate, the integrated nature of this establishment revealed in the connected spaces through which your body moves. The documents that preserve Kontor operations, the ordinances and account books and correspondence, constitute the historical trace of a system that governed men's lives with comprehensive particularity. You pause at the threshold of the outer door, the cold air of the Flemish night moving across your face, the contrast with the heated hall sudden and clarifying. The value of the Fungeld contribution, the protection and the community that it purchased, seems palpable in this moment of transition, the warmth at your back and the darkness before you. The temptations that prohibitions address are perhaps most acute in the hours after curfew, when the unregulated city offers its alternative pleasures and dangers. You remain within the precinct, the gate that will be secured visible in the torchlight of the porter's lodge, the boundary between the ordered world of the Kontor and the unpredictable world beyond clearly marked. The morning will see the obligation of worship renewed, the cycle of devotion and commerce beginning again with the regularity that characterizes this life. The small beer has left your palate now, the taste replaced by the cold clarity of the night air, the memory of the hall's warmth becoming itself a kind of sensory presence, the anticipation of its return that will accompany the hours until the next noon bell. The posture of seated attention persists in your bodily memory, the angle of elbow upon table, the position of feet upon the rushes that cover the floor. The rushlights continue in the hall you have left, tended now by the night servant who will ensure that no flame endangers the sleeping house. You observe the stars above the courtyard, the clear cold of a winter night that carries the promise of frost upon the canals, the conditions that will govern tomorrow's movement of goods and persons. The silence of sleep has replaced the murmur of low German, preserved only in the dreams of those who speak it, the unconscious continuation of community that transcends the waking rules. The pottage will rise again with the morning's preparations, the cycle of sustenance and assembly that structures each day in this place. It connects this morning to every similar morning across the decades of the Kontor's operation, the continuity of custom that constitutes its deepest strength. You find your own place now, the chamber that corresponds to your status, the narrow bed with its straw mattress and its wool coverings, the darkness that descends upon the precinct as the final lights are extinguished. The smoke of the hall fire lingers in your hair and upon your garments, the olfactory signature of this day's experience, the mark of belonging that you will carry with you into sleep and into the morning's renewal. In this moment of surrender to rest, you understand the comprehensiveness of the Kontor's jurisdiction, its extension even to the hours of darkness, the governance of dreams by the habits that the day has instilled. The greater penalty was perhaps the exclusion from this community, the isolation from the network of trust and information upon which commercial survival depended. You are lying now in the darkness of the dormitory, the breathing of other merchants around you, the occasional mutter or shift of position that speaks of shared quarters and negotiated privacy. The enforcement has become internalized, the merchant who has accepted this life, no longer requiring the external pressure of fine or reprimand to maintain its disciplines. The London Kontor and the Bergen Kontor hold their own sleepers at this same hour, the simultaneity of their rest as meaningful as the simultaneity of their meals, the temporal coordination that binds the league across its spatial dispersion. The small beer has yielded to the deeper taste of sleep, the body's gradual release of the day's stimulations, its descent toward the restoration that darkness permits. You feel the weight of the wool coverings upon you, the pressure that confirms your placement within this community. The rushlights have ceased in the hall below, the night servant having completed his rounds, the darkness complete save for the starlight that enters through the high window of your chamber. The murmur of low German dialects has become the murmur of your own thoughts, the language of interiority as well as of commerce, the mental speech that accompanies the drift toward dreams. You understand now that documentation is a form of presence, the record that preserves what sleep dissolves, the continuity that outlasts the individual consciousness. The posture of the hall has shaped your body, the expectation of tomorrow's repetition already forming in your half-aware mind. The smoke of the hall fire recedes into the larger darkness, becoming indistinguishable from the other smells of this place, the straw and the wool and the distant canal. You are standing at the harbour at dawn, or you will be, the morning's work already approaching with the first grey that will show at the window's edge, the cycle that knows no completion, only renewal. The pottage awaits you in that future, the promise that draws you through the hours of darkness toward the next assembly, the next confirmation of membership in this company of merchants who have chosen the Kontor's discipline as the price of its protection. The night deepens around you, the cold air moving across your face where the coverings have shifted, the sensation that connects you to the world beyond these walls, the Bruges that sleeps and wakes according to other rhythms, other rules. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes. The morning arrives through the warehouse shutters in pale horizontal bands, each stripe of light catching the dust that rises from the floorboards where bales have been dragged and dropped. You are standing at the long counting table when the first cart of Russian wax rolls through the arched doorway, its wheels groaning against the threshold stone. The barrels have come by river and sea from Novgorod and the Dvina region, traveling the long route through the Baltic that Hanseatic merchants have made their own. Around you, the clerks are setting out their tally sticks and sample bags, their movements quiet and practiced. The sweet, faint animal scent of beeswax warming in the hand will soon fill this space. Veckenhusen moves along the line of barrels, his fingers finding the seals that mark each shipment's origin and claimed purity. The wax from Novgorod and the Dvina region was traded via the Baltic for church candles and sealing, and every intermediary along that chain has added his own mark of trust or suspicion. You watch him select a small cask, set it on end, and draw his knife across the wax seal with a motion that is almost tender, almost surgical. The seal splits with a soft crack, revealing the pale golden mass beneath. He works free a lump the size of a hen's egg, warming it between his palms until the surface begins to yield and glow. The scent rises now in earnest, clean and complicated, carrying notes of honeycomb and smoke and the distant meadows where the hives stood. He lifts it to the light from the shutter, turning it slowly, watching for the translucency that speaks of careful rendering, the absence of dark flecks that would betray careless straining or adulteration with tallow. The quality differences in goods like this were marked by seals and lead tags, with fraud a constant concern, and he has learned to trust his own senses above any mark stamped in foreign wax. The morning progresses in its quiet commerce, the warehouse filling with the particular silence of concentration, of men absorbed in the assessment of value. For now the beams are still low and sharp, cutting through the gloom to illuminate the work of verification. Veckintusen sets aside the tested wax and moves to his correspondence, where a letter from his Visby correspondent awaits his attention. The Scania herring fishery operated seasonally, with Hanseatic fleets descending on the region in late summer and autumn, and the prudent merchant secured his provisions well before the competition gathered. He dips his pen, pauses, and begins to write the terms of an advance contract for autumn herring, specifying quantities and qualities, the schedule of delivery, the penalties for short wait or poor cure. The oily sheen of salted herring packed in brine is still months away from his warehouse, but commerce moves in the imagination before it moves in fact, in the commitment of ink to paper before the commitment of coin to cargo. The price of herring fluctuated dramatically based on catch size, preservation success, and transport costs, and the advance contract is his hedge against the uncertainty of all three. He writes of barrels and brine, of the seasonal rhythms that govern the Scania market, of the trust between men who will not meet again before the herring runs. His hand moves steadily across the page, the script compact and legible, the terms precise enough to survive dispute, flexible enough to survive the sea. The warehouse air has warmed now with the press of bodies and the friction of work. You are standing near the eastern wall where the light falls most generously, watching a bale of fine Ghent cloth being unrolled across the broad inspection table. The dense, slightly greasy weight of fine woolen cloth settles across the boards with a soft percussion, the fold lines revealing where it has been pressed for travel. Flemish cloth production centered on Bruges, Ghent, and Ypres reached its peak in the 13th and early 14th centuries before gradual decline. But the cloth before you speaks of that peak still, the weave so tight that the light barely penetrates when you lift a corner to the window. The color must be checked against a sealed sample, a small square kept in the counting house for just this purpose, protected from light and air to preserve its authority. Veckintusen produces the sample from its leather envelope, lays it beside the fresh bolt, and studies the comparison with the patience of a man who has learned that haste in inspection leads to regret in sale. The cloth seems to hold the dye differently in its folds, the surface sheen shifting as the fabric moves, and he turns the bale slowly, searching for the unevenness that would betray careless fulling or inferior wool. The quality differences in cloth were marked by seals and lead tags, with fraud a constant concern, and the sample in his hand is his only reliable witness against the merchant's promises. The morning has advanced toward noon without announcement, the light shifting from the eastern shutters to the high clerestory windows that catch the sun at its apex. The pitch and tar smell of barrels freshly coopered drifts in from the yard where the coopers are repairing the season's damage, their hammers tapping a rhythm that underlies the warehouse's more subtle music. You move through the space between the stacked goods, your hand trailing across the coarse sacking that protects a shipment of timber from the north, the grain rough against your fingertips. Furs, timber, and pitch from northern and eastern Europe complemented the core Hanseatic commodity trades, and the warehouse holds them all in temporary suspension, goods in transit toward their final transformation. The dry rustle of sample tags and tally sticks accompanies your movement, the small sounds of administration that fill the intervals between larger transactions. A clerk passes with his arms full of ledgers, his eyes downcast, his feet finding their path through familiarity rather than sight. Veckintusen has moved to the smaller chamber where private negotiations are conducted, where a Bergen factor waits with news of the Norwegian trade. You are standing at the doorway when the discussion turns to dried cod, to the expected arrival of that commodity and the Norwegian market conditions that will govern its price. The Bergen factor speaks of a late spring, of uncertain curing weather, of the competition from English merchants who have begun to press northward in their own ships. Hanseatic merchants controlled the bulk trade in these commodities, acting as intermediaries between producers and European consumers. But control is a word that implies more certainty than the trade allows, and the factor's report is threaded with the conditional, the perhaps, the wait and see. Veckentusen listens with his hands folded on the table, his fingers interlaced in the posture of a man who has learned that information gathered in silence is more valuable than information offered in haste. The oily sheen of salted herring, packed in brine, belongs to a different coast, a different season, but in his mind it exists in relation to this cod, the substitutes and complements that shape a market's logic. He asks his questions finally, each one precise and limited, drawing from the factor the specific intelligence that his ledgers require. The afternoon has begun its long descent by the time the factor departs, the light angling through the western windows in shafts that pick out the motes of dust and fibre suspended in the warehouse air. The dust motes turn slowly in the stillness, each particle visible and singular, descending and rising according to currents too subtle to feel. You are standing at the counting table where Veckentusen has returned to his calculations, his pen making the small scratching sounds that accompany his concentration. He works at the profit margin on a speculative wax purchase, the Russian wax from Novgorod and the Divina region that he tested in the morning's first hour. The figures accumulate in his neat script, the purchase price and the expected sale, the costs of transport and storage, and the interest on advance payment, the risk of price movement between now and delivery. Hanseatic merchants developed sophisticated credit instruments, including bills of exchange and advance contracts for future delivery, and his calculation must account for the time value of money across the distance between Bruges and the Baltic ports. The sweet, faint animal scent of beeswax has faded from the chamber, but the memory of that quality informs his speculation, the certainty of good merchandise supporting the uncertainty of future price. The warehouse has begun to empty of its morning crowd, the clerks departing for their midday meal, the labourers drifting toward the yards where the coopers work. The pitch and tar smell of barrels freshly coopered remains, persistent as the industry it signifies, the constant renewal of containers that the trade requires. You move among the remaining goods, your hand brushing the sacking of a grain shipment from the Baltic hinterland, particularly from Prussia and Livonia, that became increasingly important from the late 13th century. The kernels shift beneath your touch, dry and individual, each one a small investment of soil and season, and the long transport to this warehouse floor. The sack before you represents the continuation of that importance into the present moment, the present year, the present speculation of merchants who have never seen the fields where it grew. Veckentusen has completed his calculation and sits in the fading light with his pen suspended, reviewing the columns for error or oversight. The diminishing illumination seems to concentrate his attention rather than disperse it. He reaches for a small bag of the tested wax, the sample from the morning's inspection, and sets it on the table before him. From his belt, he draws his personal seal, the metal warmed by his body's heat, and presses it into the soft surface of a wax tablet that he keeps for temporary impressions. The mark must be transferred to the sample bag for verification in Lübeck, where his partners will compare it against their own records of his seal's design. He works carefully, melting a small portion of the sample wax with a candle's flame, dripping it onto the bag's closure, pressing his seal into the cooling surface with a firm and even pressure. The warehouse has entered that hour of suspension between the day's labor and the evening's account, the space between effort and reckoning that merchants know as the time of truth. You are standing near the shuttered windows, where the last light filters in narrow blades, casting long shadows across the floor where the bales still wait their turn for inspection. The dense, slightly greasy weight of fine woolen cloth from Ghent lies where it was unrolled, now loosely refolded, its quality established and recorded, its fate awaiting the next decision. Around you, the remaining clerks move quietly through their final tasks, the tally sticks gathered and bound, the sample bags stored in their appointed chest, the ledgers closed and locked against the night. The evening advances without ceremony, the light withdrawing from the high windows as steadily as it advanced in the morning, the cycle completing its turn. Veckenhusen seals a sample bag with his personal mark for verification in Lübeck, and the gesture seems to close something larger than this single transaction, to complete a pattern that repeats across the Hanseatic network, across the Baltic and North Sea, across the seasons of wax and herring and cloth. The commodities of a life accumulate in such moments, in the testing and recording, in the speculation and verification, in the trust established between men who share a mark and a code, but may never share a table. He sets the sealed bag among the others awaiting the next northbound ship, and stands for a moment in the gathering gloom, his hand resting on the table's worn edge, his mind already moving toward the next morning's work, the next shipment, the next season of the endless commercial year. The night arrives through the warehouse shutters in pale horizontal bands of darkness, each stripe of shadow absorbing what the morning's light revealed. The sweet, faint animal scent of beeswax has long faded, replaced by the more general perfume of commerce, the accumulated residue of all the goods that have passed through this chamber. The pitch and tar smell of barrels freshly coopered lingers at the edges of perception, the olfactory signature of an industry that continues its work beyond the hours of daylight. The oily sheen of salted herring packed in brine exists now only in anticipation, in the advance contract written to a Visby correspondent, in the seasonal promise that the Scania fishery will yield its harvest when the autumn comes. You move toward the doorway where the evening air moves across your face, cooler than the warehouse's accumulated warmth, carrying the sounds of a city that continues its existence beyond the concerns of trade. The dust motes have settled now, their brief visibility concluded until the next day's sun calls them forth again. The dry rustle of sample tags and tally sticks has given way to the more distant sounds of evening, the calls of watchmen, the closing of gates, the gradual withdrawal of public life into private space. Veckenhusen remains in his chamber, his figure visible in the candlelight that flickers through the doorway, bent over his final correspondence. The commodities of a life surround him in the darkness. The wax and cloth and herring that have occupied his day now become shapes in the gloom, presences without detail, awaiting the morning's renewed attention. He writes of Lübeck and Novgorod, of Ghent and Bergen, of the network of obligation and expectation that binds the Hanseatic merchant to his world. The dense, slightly greasy weight of fine woolen cloth, the sweet, faint animal scent of beeswax warming in the hand, the oily sheen of salted herring packed in brine. These are the textures of a life measured in bales and barrels, in the careful calculation of quality against price, of risk against return. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes in distant ports, in Visby and Bergen, in Lübeck, and the Scania shores where the herring will soon run. The Hanseatic merchants controlled the bulk trade in these commodities, acting as intermediaries between producers and European consumers, and their control continues in the darkness, in the advance contracts and sealed samples, in the credit instruments that bind the future to the present. The grain from the Baltic hinterland, particularly from Prussia and Livonia, that became increasingly important from the late 13th century, moves invisibly through the night on ships that navigate by stars and memory. The furs, timber, and pitch from northern and eastern Europe that complemented the core Hanseatic commodity trades travel their own routes, their own schedules, their own rhythm of departure and arrival. Veckentusen extinguishes his candle and emerges into the main warehouse, his figure a darker shape in the darkness, moving with the certainty of long familiarity. He pauses at the counting table, his hand finding the sealed bag that waits for Lübeck, verifying its presence by touch in the absence of sight. The quality differences in goods were marked by seals and lead tags, with fraud a constant concern, and his personal mark is his guarantee in a world where guarantees are the currency of trade. He moves toward the door where you stand, and for a moment you are both suspended in the threshold, between the warehouse's darkness and the city's lesser dark, between the day's completed labor and the night's uncertain rest. The Bruges night receives you both, the streets narrower and more winding than the daylight reveals, the canals black and still between their stone embankments. You are walking at a measured pace through the quarter where the merchants lodge, where the warehouses give way to dwellings, where the signs of the various nations hang dark above their doors. The Kontor's discipline has released you for these hours, the rules of membership suspended until the morning's bell calls you back to its routines. Your lodging lies ahead, a room above a stable where the merchant's life permits a temporary privacy. The sweet, faint animal scent of beeswax warming in the hand returns unbidden, called forth by the night's coolness, by the walking that stirs the blood and revives the senses. You climb the stairs in darkness, finding each tread by habit, and enter the chamber where the bed waits, its coverings turned back in preparation. The night completes its embrace as you settle into the yielding surface, the body's weight finding its position, the mind gradually releasing its hold on the day's transactions. The dry rustle of sample tags and tally sticks seems to persist in the inner ear, the auditory residue of a life spent in the counting house, the warehouse, the endless assessment of value. The pitch and tar smell of barrels freshly coopered has followed you somehow, or perhaps it is only memory now, the olfactory imagination supplying what the physical world has withdrawn. The oily sheen of salted herring packed in brine will come, the autumn's promise held in the advance contract written to a Visby correspondent, the seasonal rhythm that governs even the speculative life. The darkness deepens, the body's warmth gradually equalizing with the coverings, the chamber, the night air that moves through the imperfect closures of window and door. You are drifting now, the specific textures of the day's commerce giving way to a more general sense of plenty and provision, of the warehouse's stacked abundance translated into the security of rest. The dust motes in afternoon warehouse light, suspended above stacked goods, have long since settled, but in the mind's eye they continue their slow revolution, the visible signature of air and light, and the patience of observation. Veckentusen lies elsewhere in the same darkness, his calculations concluded, his seals impressed, his samples secured for the journey to Lübeck. The commodities of a life surround him too, in the ledger entries and correspondence, in the memory of wax tested and cloth unrolled, in the expectation of herring that the autumn will bring to the Scania shores. The sophisticated credit instruments that Hanseatic merchants developed bind the future to the present in ways that persist through sleep, through darkness, through the temporary dissolution of the merchant's conscious vigilance. The night moves toward its middle, the hour when even the watchman's calls grow sparse, and the city's life contracts to its essential core. You are sinking now, the body's weight surrendering to the surface that supports it, the mind's last commerce giving way to the quiet that precedes and follows all transaction. The cold air moves across your face where the coverings have shifted, and the sensation is neither pleasant nor unpleasant, only present, only the body's continuous registration of its situation in the world. The Bruges that sleeps and wakes according to other rhythms, other rules, continues its existence beyond your perception. The warehouses and counting houses waiting for the morning's return, the renewal of the commercial life that will resume as it has resumed, as it will continue to resume, the endless circulation of wax and cloth and herring, of grain and timber and fur, of all the commodities that compose the Hanseatic world and the lives of those who move within it. The darkness is complete now, the inner and outer night indistinguishable, the body surrendered to its rest. Somewhere the advance contract for autumn herring waits in its drawer, the sealed sample bag for Lübeck waits in its chest. The personal mark waits to be impressed again on the cooling wax of future transactions. The commodities of a life persist through the darkness, through the sleep, through the temporary interruption of the merchant's conscious purpose. The night holds you, the darkness complete, the body still. The warehouse waits in its own darkness, the goods stacked and covered, the tally sticks bound, the sample tags stored. The dust motes await the morning's light, the pitch and tar smell awaits the cooper's hammers, the dry rustle of commerce awaits the pen's renewal. You are held in this suspension, this interval between the day's labor and the day's return, the merchant's rest that is itself a kind of preparation, a gathering of resource for the effort that will resume. The cold air moves across your face, and you do not move to adjust the coverings, accepting the sensation as you have learned to accept all sensation, as information, as presence, as the body's continuous dialogue with the world that surrounds and sustains it. The depth of night, the depth of sleep, the depth of commerce that continues in dreams and darkness, in the advance contracts and sealed samples, in the credit instruments that bind stranger to stranger across the distances of sea and season. The commodities of a life, the commodities of a world, the wax and cloth and herring that move through the merchant's hands toward their final transformation, their final use, their final consumption in flame and garment and sustenance. The darkness continues, the sleep deepens, the body turns in its own slow rhythm, seeking comfort, seeking rest, seeking the renewal that will permit the morning's return to the counting house, the warehouse, the endless assessment of value and quality, of risk and return, of trust given and trust verified. The night is long, the sleep is long, the commercial year is long, and all are aspects of the same duration, the same human passage through time and trade, through the commodities that compose a life and the life that composes a world. The cold air moves across your face, and you are sinking into the darkness that holds all things in temporary suspension, the wax and cloth and herring, the advance contracts and sealed samples, the personal marks and public seals, all held in the darkness that precedes the morning, that precedes the renewal, that precedes the endless continuation of commerce and its disciplines, its rewards, its quiet, persistent, necessary human order. The acrid smoke of tallow, thicker than beeswax, clings to the ceiling beams in Hildebrand Weckenhuysen's chamber, gathering in yellowed strata that will not be cleaned until spring. You are standing near the narrow writing desk where the merchant has placed his materials, the ribbed paper from the papermaker at the wharf, the iron gall ink in its horn container, the quills trimmed and ready. Cold seeps through the worn floorboards from the frozen canal below, rising to meet your ankles where no vessels move tonight. Around you, the household has settled after the communal meal, the servants withdrawn to their own quarters, the fire in the hall reduced to embers. The distant sound of the city watch calling the hour drifts across the sleeping harbour, marking a time when honest men should rest. Yet Veckentusen works on. The surviving correspondence of over 500 letters represents one of the richest sources for late medieval merchant life and business practice, and you are witnessing the creation of one such document. Veckentusen sits on the wooden stool, his shoulders rounded against the stiffness of fingers in unheated air, pausing to warm them over the candle flame that gutters in the draught from the shuttered window. His clerk, a young man from the Low Countries who has learned the cursive merchant hand, waits with pen suspended. The tallow candles, made from animal fat, are the standard lighting for evening writing, beeswax being a luxury that Veckentusen reserves for his most distinguished visitors. You watch the merchant compose his thoughts, his lips moving slightly as he translates the day's transactions into phrases that will travel to Lübeck. He dictates to his clerk a letter to his brother Sivert in Lübeck, reporting prices and requesting credit, his voice low and measured against the crackling of the tallow. The price of dried fish has risen in the Bergen market, he reports, while English wool remains scarce due to the unsettled conditions in the Channel ports. He names figures that you cannot follow, marks that represent the movement of capital across the German Sea and beyond, the advance contracts and sealed samples that bind merchant to merchant across impossible distances. The scratch of quill on ribbed paper fills the chamber with its deliberate rhythm, each letter formed with the care of one who knows that errors waste precious materials. The cost of paper, ink, and courier fees has made letter writing a significant expense, and Veckentusen permits no waste. The warmth of the sealing wax against the palm before pressing the metal signet remains distant, for this first letter is not yet complete. Veckentusen pauses, the stiffness of fingers in unheated air causing him to warm them again over the candle flame, and he looks toward the shuttered window as if he might see through the planks to the frozen harbor beyond. The winter evenings in Northern Europe impose long hours of darkness, constraining literate activity to these precious hours when the body demands rest, but commerce demands attention. You feel the cold creeping through the floorboards from the canal below, and you understand why the merchant keeps his cloak draped across his shoulders, even indoors, why his breath makes small clouds in the tallow light. He adds a personal paragraph about his health and the cold, instructing his brother Sivert to greet their mother, and his voice changes slightly, becomes less the instrument of business and more the instrument of family. The ache in his chest has not worsened, he reports, though the physician's remedies taste of iron and regret. He asks after Sivert's children by name, mentions the baptism he missed in the autumn when ice blocked the sound. The acrid smoke of tallow continues its slow accumulation against the ceiling, a record of hours spent in this necessary labor. The scratch of quill on ribbed paper resumes as the clerk transcribes these personal sentences with the same care he gave to the price of fish. Letters were typically dictated to clerks or written by merchants themselves in a cursive merchant hand, and you observe the fluid connection between thought and instrument, the merchant's voice becoming the clerk's hand, becoming the words that will be read aloud upon receipt in Lübeck. The Hanseatic lingua franca of correspondence is Low German, Niederdeutsch or Plattdeutsch, written in adapted Latin script that carries the sounds of northern harbors and counting houses. Veckentusen speaks in this tongue now, the private language of his family merging with the commercial language of his class. He seals the letter with wax and his signet, entrusting it to a departing shipmaster for Bergen and thence overland, and you watch the ritual of closure. He chooses the red wax, the color of his house, and impresses his mark with the ring that has served his father and his father's father. The tallow candles gutter in the draught from the shuttered window, and for a moment the light falters, casting his shadow tall against the beam where the smoke has gathered. Correspondence travelled via merchant couriers, ship captains, or later via post riders between established stations, and Veckentusen considers his options as the wax cools. The shipmaster bound for Bergen departs with the morning tide, carrying this first letter in a leather packet that will be transferred at the Norwegian port to a coastal vessel, then to an overland courier, then perhaps to post riders stationed at inns or post stations, transporting sealed letter packets to neighbouring stations in a relay that spans the Hanseatic world. Letters could take weeks or months to reach their destination, depending on season and route, and this letter to Sivert in Lübeck, this letter with its prices and its greetings to their mother, may not arrive before the spring thaw opens the Baltic fully. The cold creeping through the floorboards seems to intensify as Veckentusen sets the first letter aside and reaches for a second sheet of the ribbed paper. You are standing near enough to see that his movements have changed, become more deliberate, more guarded. He dismisses the clerk with a gesture, and the young man withdraws, his own fingers stiff from the unheated air, pausing to warm them over the candle flame before he closes the chamber door. The merchant waits until the footsteps fade, until the distant sound of the city watch calling the hour has passed and been replaced by silence absolute and waiting. He writes a second, more confidential letter in cipher regarding a disputed debt, and you observe how his body shields the paper from any possible observation, how his quill moves in patterns that correspond to no language you recognize. Merchants developed coded language and marks to verify identity and detect tampering, and Veckentusen employs systems that he shares only with his most trusted correspondents, substitutions that transform names into numbers, numbers into symbols, meanings into puzzles that would require months to unravel without the key. The scratch of quill on ribbed paper continues in this secretive register, the same physical act now carrying a freight of concealment. The acrid smoke of tallow fills the chamber more densely now that the door is closed, the single window shuttered against the winter night. Winter evenings in northern Europe imposed long hours of darkness, constraining literate activity to these hours when the merchant could be alone with his most dangerous thoughts. The stiffness of fingers in unheated air causes Veckentusen to pause to warm them over the candle flame more frequently now. Yet he does not hurry his cipher, knowing that error in encoding is worse than error in plain writing, that a misapplied substitution might transform threat into confession, demand into surrender. You are standing in the corner where the light does not reach, where the smoke gathers in its yellowed accumulation, and you feel the weight of mercantile secrecy that surrounds this second composition. Merchant letters combined business intelligence, family news, political information, and personal sentiment, and this second document contains elements of all these categories in compressed and hidden form. The disputed debt, connecting to family alliance, connecting to municipal politics, connecting to the merchant's own precarious standing in a world where credit was reputation, and reputation was survival. He seals the second letter with a different wax, a darker color, impressing the private mark that corresponds to no public register. He wraps it in oiled cloth, then in leather, then in a second wrapping that bears a false address, a merchant in Bergen who will know to forward the packet through channels that Veckentusen does not specify even in his own mind. The scratch of quill on ribbed paper has ceased, replaced by the softer sounds of concealment and preparation. The cold creeping through the floorboards seems to recede slightly, or perhaps you have simply accustomed yourself to its persistent presence, this fundamental condition of northern commerce. Veckentusen places both letters in the strongbox, the first to be delivered to the shipmaster with the morning, the second to await a more trusted carrier, A cousin's factor who arrives in 3 days with wool from the English ports. You have witnessed the creation of 2 documents that will enter that archive of over 500 letters, one open and one closed, one legible to any clerk and one legible only to those who share the merchant's secrets. The acrid smoke of tallow has begun to sting your eyes, or perhaps the sting is simply the accumulated fatigue of observation, the weight of watching another's necessary labor. You are standing at the threshold now, neither fully in the chamber nor fully withdrawn, and the merchant does not acknowledge your presence, has never acknowledged your presence, for you are the darkness that holds his actions, the medium through which his century speaks. He sits motionless for a long moment, his hands folded on the desk where the quill rests in its horn container, the ink slowly settling, the ribbed paper stacked for future use. The stiffness of fingers in unheated air has passed into a general stiffness of posture, the merchant's body announcing its readiness for rest, even as his mind continues its slow circulation of figures, obligations, possibilities. Vekintusen imagines, or remembers, or plans the route that his ciphered letter will follow, the changes of horse and rider that carry meaning across the frozen landscape, faster than any individual traveler could move. Commerce existed in this temporal dislocation, this necessary faith that words sent into darkness would emerge into light at their destination, transformed but still legible, still capable of binding merchant to merchant across the distances that defined their world. The scratch of quill on ribbed paper has become a memory almost immediate, the rhythm of dictation and transcription still echoing in the chamber's silence. You are sinking into that silence now, into the darkness that holds all things in temporary suspension, the wax and cloth and herring, the advance contracts and sealed samples, the personal marks and public seals. The cold creeping through the floorboards has spread across the entire chamber, equalizing temperature between inside and outside, between the merchant's labor and the winter's indifference. Vekintusen does not relight the extinguished candle, accepting this reduction as he accepts so many reductions, the necessary economies of northern life. He rises from the stool, his joints audible in the silence, and moves to the shuttered window, placing his palm against the wood as if he might feel through it to the frozen harbor, the waiting ships, the city sleeping under its blanket of snow and darkness. In the low German tongue he has spoken to his brother, has written to his factor, has composed his secrets in cipher, this language that binds the Baltic and the North Sea into a single commercial imagination, a single network of trust and calculation and occasional betrayal. The acrid smoke of tallow has begun to dissipate, or perhaps you have simply ceased to perceive it, your senses withdrawing from this scene as the merchant withdraws from his labor, as the night withdraws toward its eventual, inevitable, temporary ending. Vekintusen removes his cloak from his shoulders and folds it across the stool, a gesture of completion, of transition from one state to another. The stiffness of fingers in unheated air has been replaced by a general fatigue that requires no particular localization, the whole body announcing its participation in the long hours of darkness. He will sleep now, or try to sleep, in the chamber adjoining this one, where the cold creeping through the floorboards is slightly less immediate, where the tallow candles gutter in the draught from a different shuttered window, where the scratch of quill on ribbed paper has not yet occurred, and will not occur until another evening brings its own necessities. You are standing at the harbor at dawn, though dawn has not yet come, standing in the darkness that precedes the morning, that precedes the renewal, that precedes the endless continuation of commerce and its disciplines, its rewards, its quiet, persistent, necessary human order. You have been present at the origin of 2 documents, have witnessed the transformation of thought into inscription, of inscription into packet, of packet into the vast circulatory system of Hanseatic communication. The cost of paper, ink, and courier fees made letter writing a significant expense, and Veckintusen's careful economy with materials, his dismissal of the clerk, his own composition of the ciphered letter, all testify to this constant pressure of cost against necessity, of scarcity against the imperative to maintain connection across distance. The acrid smoke of tallow lingers in the chamber as a presence without source, the accumulated record of hours you have witnessed, words you have heard, silences you have inhabited. The cold creeping through the floorboards from the canal below continues its slow rise, indifferent to the merchant's sleep, to your own drifting attention, to the letters that wait in darkness for the carriers who will bear them toward their various destinations. The scratch of quill on ribbed paper has ceased, yet its rhythm persists in your perception, a ghost sound that will accompany you into the sleep that gathers at the edges of this observation. Veckintusen has composed his day, has composed his letters, has composed himself for the rest that winter enforces upon even the most diligent. The stiffness of fingers in unheated air has become your own sensation now, or perhaps it has always been your own. The cold that accompanies all observation, all memory, all the slow drift towards sleep that this chamber, this merchant, this winter night have made possible. Veckintusen sleeps now, or dreams of prices and routes, of his brother's response, of the spring that will open the Baltic and bring new possibilities, new dangers, new letters to be composed in the long hours of tallow light. The post riders stationed at inns or post stations sleep too, or tend their horses, or warm themselves at fires that will soon receive the packets they must carry. The shipmaster bound for Bergen lies in his own chamber, his vessel prepared, his course calculated, his hold waiting for the cargo that will make the voyage profitable, that will connect this harbour to that harbour in the endless chain of exchange. The cold creeping through the floorboards has become indistinguishable from the general cold of the night, of the season, of the latitude that imposes this long darkness upon those who choose to live and trade at the edge of the frozen sea. The tallow candles, made from animal fat, the standard lighting for evening writing, have completed their service, their substance transformed into light and smoke, and the yellowed accumulation on the ceiling beams. You are sinking, sinking, and the chamber recedes, the merchant recedes, the correspondence of over 500 letters recedes into the archive that preserves it, the scholarly labor that has made it speak across the centuries to those who would understand how commerce was conducted, how trust was maintained, how families persisted, how the night was endured by those who had worked to complete before the dawn permitted rest. You are standing at the harbour of Lübeck in the grey hour before true dawn, when the sky above the warehouses holds the colour of wet slate, and the water below reflects nothing but the dim lanterns of ships preparing to depart. Around you, the quayside stirs with the particular activity of early spring, that season when the ice has retreated from the Trav, and the first cogs of the trading year begin their passage through the Sound toward the wider commerce of the North Sea. The vessel before you is a Hanseatic cog, that dominant ship from the late 12th to the 14th centuries, characterized by a flat bottom, high sides, and a single square sail that now hangs furled against its yard like a sleeping wing. You watch as men move upon her deck, their silhouettes passing before the glow of a brazier where pitch is being warmed for the final corking of the season's seams. The cold air moves across your face, carrying the reek of bilge water mixed with tar and wet wool from a dozen vessels moored along the timber wharves. Hemp ropes creak through wooden blocks as neighbouring ships adjust their rigging for the morning's work. Somewhere in the misted distance, a church bell marks the hour, though which church you cannot determine, so layered is the sound with the slap of waves against hulls, and the low murmur of men speaking Low German in the hushed tones of those who labour before the world has fully woken. The cog you are to board stands high in the water still, her flat bottom settling against the mud of the harbour bed, her sides rising like a wooden wall above the quay. She was built in the clinker fashion once common to northern waters, overlapping planks riveted together, though now you observe the smoother lines of carvel construction where flush planking allows for greater capacity within her hold, the timbers fitting edge to create a surface almost seamless to the searching eye. Veckenhusen moves through the crowd of merchants and their factors, his own factors preceding him with tallies and wax-sealed documents that record the bales and barrels now being lowered through the cog's open hatch. The Hanseatic cog could carry 100 to 200 tons of cargo, with a crew of 15 to 25 men, and this vessel seems appointed toward the larger end of that measure, her beam wide enough to accommodate the bulk goods that make the long voyage worthwhile. You step aboard behind him, feeling the slight give of the deck planks beneath your boots, the vessel responding to your weight with the subtle intimacy of a thing that knows water intimately. Around you, the merchants are unloading their anxieties along with their goods, for Baltic crossings were dangerous, subject to storms, shallows, ice, and piracy, including the later Vitilienbrüder, that brotherhood of privateers who would operate as blockade runners from 1389 to 1394 before their turn to open predation. The sail begins its ascent, the yard rising on the creak of hemp rope through wooden blocks, the sound rhythmic and unhurried, a mechanical breathing that will accompany all your waking hours upon this vessel. The crew of perhaps 20 men work with the coordinated efficiency of those who have performed these motions through many seasons, their hands finding the lines in darkness as readily as in this grey half-light. You observe the single square sail taking shape against the sky, its canvas bearing the marks of previous voyages, patches and reinforcements that tell of weather survived and strains endured. Navigation relied upon landmarks, soundings, and simple compasses in this age. Charts were rare and rudimentary, their parchment holdings more suggestive than precise, more memory than measurement. The cog casts off from the quay, oars extended from her sides like the legs of some ponderous water insect, propelling her through the still water of the inner harbour until the sail catches the offshore breeze and fills with a sudden billowing that you feel through the deck planks as much as see above. The slap of waves against the high-sided hull begins in earnest now, the spray cold on your face as the vessel finds her heading and the shore of Lübeck begins its slow recession. Voyages from Lübeck to Bruges took 1 to 3 weeks depending on wind and weather, and you understand that you have entered into a duration measured not by hours, but by the quality of air and the angle of canvas, by the patience of merchants and the endurance of ships. The endless grey-green of the Baltic spreads before you under an overcast April sky, the horizon dissolving into clouds so completely that the distinction between water and heaven becomes a matter of faith rather than perception. You make your way to the deck where Veckenhusen has established himself among his goods, a small territory marked by the bales of his merchandise and the portable desk, upon which he writes his letters even as the vessel finds her rhythm upon the swell. Ships carried mixed cargoes and passengers, with merchants often travelling with their goods, and you find yourself sharing the cramped deck with barrels of Prussian grain and bundles of timber, the latter smelling of fresh sap and forest still, the former giving off the dry, almost dusty scent of stored abundance. The reek of bilge water mixed with tar and wet wool asserts itself more strongly in the open water, a constant olfactory presence that will become so familiar as to seem almost natural by voyage's end. Crew conditions were cramped, with sailors sleeping on deck or in the forecastle among the cargo, and you observe where the men have already stowed their sea chests and bedding rolls in corners that will serve them through nights of cold and damp. The taste of hard bread and salted pork comes to you at the midday meal, the barrel broached for the voyage, and its contents distributed with democratic impartiality among all aboard, for distinctions of rank diminish upon the water where common dependence creates temporary equality. The shipmaster moves among his passengers and crew with the measured authority of one whose knowledge is practical rather than theoretical, whose understanding of the Baltic derives from years of bodily immersion in its moods rather than from any text. The Sound and belts between Denmark and Sweden lay ahead, those choke points requiring payment or negotiation with local authorities, and you sense the calculations already forming in Veckentusen's mind, the costs to be weighed against the profits that await in Flanders, the connections that must be maintained even at the price of silver pennies, dropped into Danish palms. The first day passes into the first night, the cog maintaining her course through darkness, relieved only by a lantern hung aft, and the dim stars that appear in rifts of cloud. The cry of the leadman calling depths reaches you at intervals, the line wet in his hands as he casts it forward and hauls it back, his voice carrying the numbers that mean safe passage or hidden danger. You lie upon your own appointed space among the cargo, feeling the vessel's motion through every joint and muscle, the particular sway of a flat-bottomed hull that differs from the sharper keel of other craft. Sleep comes fragmented, disturbed by the creak of hemp rope through wooden blocks as the yard adjusts to shifting winds, by the sudden calls of the watch as some perceived hazard demands attention. Morning brings grey light, and the continued presence of the Pomeranian coast upon your larboard side, a low dark line that the vessel follows with prudent distance. 3 days out, a squall from the southwest drives them toward that same coast, the wind rising with the sudden violence that characterizes these waters in spring, the square sail hardening against its constraints until the crew furls it with desperate speed, and the vessel rides upon her oars and her fortune. You feel the shudder of the hull as waves strike her beam, the held breath of all aboard palpable in the cramped space, where merchants and sailors alike have sought what shelter the deck affords. The shipmaster consults with Veckentusen and other merchants whether to risk the open sea or seek shelter, their conference conducted in shouts against the wind's roar, their gestures emphatic with the urgency of those who must decide upon imperfect knowledge. The decision falls for shelter, the cog turning her flat bottom toward the lee of a headland that offers some break against the southwest's fury. You endure hours of waiting as the storm spends its force upon the shore, the reek of bilge water mixed with tar and wet wool, intensified by the damp of driven spray, the cold penetrating through layers of wool and leather, until you understand why sailors develop that particular patience with discomfort that marks the seafaring life. The grey-green of the Baltic has become the grey-black of tempest, the overcast April sky now indistinguishable from the water below, the horizon lost in a chaos of wind and wave that makes navigation by landmark impossible and navigation by simple compass an act of faith. Shipwreck and cargo loss were constant risks, addressed through communal insurance arrangements and distributed risk, and you comprehend now the wisdom of those systems, the spreading of catastrophes cost across many voyages so that no single disaster might destroy entirely. The squall passes as suddenly as it arrived, leaving a confused sea that the cog meets with her characteristic stolidity, her high sides shedding the remnants of wave, her flat bottom finding stability in waters that would trouble more elegant craft. The sail is set again, the creak of hemp rope through wooden blocks resuming its place in the soundscape of your existence. The voyage continues, days marked by the slow alteration of coastlines, the passage of headlands and estuaries, the occasional sight of other vessels upon the same commercial routes. You fall into the rhythm of shipboard life, the meals of hard bread and salted pork, the consultations of the leadman with his wet line, the negotiations with local pilots as the cog approaches the Danish waters where tolls must be paid and permissions secured. Winter ice closed Baltic ports, restricting sailing season roughly from March to November, and you feel in your bones the urgency that drives these spring departures, the need to complete the passage before autumn's gales and winter's freezing make it impossible. The Vitalian brooder, those brothers of provision who would become brothers of predation, haunt the margins of conversation among the merchants, their presence still potential rather than actual in this year before their formal emergence, yet anticipated in the precautions of armed men upon the deck and the careful routing that avoids known dangers. You understand now the longevity of the cog's dominance, the fitness of her design for these particular waters and these particular trades, the flat bottom that allows beaching and loading where harbours are primitive, the high sides that offer defence against the sea and against less natural threats. The sound is past, the tolls paid in the coin of the realm and the coin of patience, the cog threading her way through the complicated geography of Danish islands and Swedish shores. The belts follow, each narrowing a test of nerve and negotiation, local authorities extending their hands for the customs that commerce has made customary. You observe Veckentusen in these moments, his composure intact, his documents ready, his Latin and his Low German both deployed with the fluency of long practice. The North Sea opens before you at last, the coastlines of Germany and the Low Countries replacing the Scandinavian shores, the navigation growing more familiar to these merchants of the western routes. You taste the hard bread and salted pork with something approaching appetite now, your body adapted to the limitations of shipboard provision, your expectations adjusted to the barrel broached for the voyage and its diminishing contents. The cry of the leadman calling depths continues, the line wet in his hands as he works his way forward and back along the deck, his voice carrying the reassurance of continued water beneath the flat bottom. The shudder of the hull grounding on a sandbar at low tide comes once, unexpectedly, the held breath of all aboard followed by the gradual release as the vessel settles without damage. The tides return promising liberation. After 2 weeks, the low dunes of Flanders appear, that gradual emergence of land from water that marks the end of passage and the beginning of new commerce. The pilot is taken aboard at Sluys, a local man whose knowledge of the channels and shoals of this coast supplements the broader navigation that has brought the cog so far. You watch his consultation with the shipmaster, the deference shown to his particular expertise, the recognition that all knowledge is local at some point, that the general must always yield to the specific when specific survival is at stake. The grey-green of the Baltic has given way to the different grey-green of the North Sea approaches. The overcast April sky, perhaps slightly lighter here, perhaps merely imagined so by your own anticipation of arrival. The cog moves through the final channels, her flat bottom finding the deeper water that the pilot indicates, her high sides passing the markers and beacons that guide this last passage. The single square sail is furled, the creak of hemp rope through wooden blocks subsiding as the yard is lowered and secured, the oars extending again for the final approach to the quays where Flemish merchants await their Hanseatic counterparts. You stand upon the deck and feel the change that arrival brings, the shift from the suspended time of voyage to the purposeful time of commerce, from the communal risk of the sea to the individual calculation of market and exchange. The slap of waves against the high-sided hull becomes the memory of motion, the body's continued expectation of sway upon stable ground. Veckentusen gathers his documents, his tallies, his preparations for the negotiations that await, his mind already moving from the hazards of passage to the opportunities of arrival. The cog that was clinker-built initially, then carvel-built with flush planking for larger cargo capacity, has served her purpose, her timbers and her crew ready for the return voyage when winds and season permit, when the cycle of commerce demands once more the endurance of flat bottom and high sides upon the grey-green waters of the Baltic and the North Sea. You disembark at last, the quay of sloughs giving way to the roads that lead to Bruges, to the continuation of that slow pulse of commercial organism that extends from this harbour to Lübeck, to Borgen, to London, to the furthest stations of the Hanseatic League where Low German was spoken, and Latin script was adapted, and letters were read aloud upon receipt, their contents shared with trusted associates, their secrets preserved in cipher, their costs calculated against the profits they enabled. The connections they maintained, the darkness they traversed to reach the light of understanding, the water they crossed to reach the solid ground where understanding might be converted to action, to exchange, to the accumulation of that wealth which is the material record of human relation across the distances that the cog, with her flat bottom and her high sides and her single square sail, was built to diminish. You are standing at the frozen harbour of Bruges, where the medieval warm period that had endured for 4 centuries is gradually releasing its hold upon the world. The canals that once carried wine from Gascony and wool from England have become corridors of black ice, their surfaces expanding in the night frost with sounds like distant musket fire, like the crack of ice that wakes you from shallow sleep before dawn. Around you, the empty masts of the last departed cogs stand in the shipyard like a forest stripped of leaves, their rigging removed and stored against the damp, their hulls propped on wooden shores to wait for spring. The cold air moves across your face, carrying the smell of closed rooms from the warehouses behind you, breath and bodies, and burning fuel mingling in the stillness of a city that has slowed almost to stillness. The weight of woolen layers presses against your shoulders, never quite enough against the damp cold that rises from the frozen mud beneath your boots, that seeps through the leather and finds the gaps between garment and skin. The Little Ice Age, conventionally dated from the early 14th century, has made itself known in Bruges through these severe winters that now come more frequently than memory recalls, more severely than the merchants of the Hanseatic League have learned to expect. Baltic ports regularly froze in these decades, isolating merchants and delaying spring departures that once had been predictable as the return of swallows. You feel this isolation in the silence where cartwheels once rattled, in the absence of river traffic that had been the city's heartbeat and its purpose. The pale, brief sun above the Flemish plain offers no warmth as it crosses the low southern sky, its light the colour of old parchment, of the account books that await their morning attention. The distant bells of Bruges mark hours that pass slowly, each stroke absorbed by the heavy air before it can travel far, before it can summon more than a handful of the faithful to prayer. Veckentusen rises in darkness, as he has risen since December froze the canals of Bruges, and the last ship departed weeks ago, carrying the final autumn correspondence to Lübeck and Bergen and the distant wharves of Novgorod. The medieval warm period that had persisted circa 900 to 1300 gradually gave way to cooler conditions, and the 14th century is experiencing increased climatic variability that makes each season an uncertainty, each voyage a calculation against worsening odds. He dresses in the woolen layers that have become his second skin, never quite enough against the damp cold that penetrates the Kontor house where the Hanseatic merchants maintain their communal existence. The smell of closed rooms accompanies his descent to the kitchen, breath and bodies, and burning fuel concentrated in spaces where windows remain shuttered against the penetration of air that carries only additional chill. He breaks his fast with preserved food that has turned monotonous. Salt fish, dried peas, stale bread, the taste of each familiar to the point of invisibility, nourishment without pleasure, sustenance without variation. The urban food supplies upon which the Kontor depends during winter months consist entirely of such preserved goods, fresh produce being virtually unavailable in a season when no cart can reach the city from the surrounding countryside, when no vessel can bring oranges from Spain or grain from the Baltic shores. Veckenhusen chews without tasting, his mind already turning to the morning's work, to the accounts that accumulated through the busy autumn and now demand reconciliation in the weak light of January. The plague from the mid-14th century caused population losses regionally up to 30%, and some scholars argue for even higher death tolls in certain regions, disruptions that echo still in the labor shortages that delay deliveries, in the abandoned holdings that reduce the agricultural surplus upon which commercial cities depend. Post-plague, abandoned arable land converted to pasture increased meat consumption among survivors, but meat too must be preserved in this season, salted or smoked or rendered into forms that can endure the months of isolation. You follow Veckenhusen through the narrow streets to the chapel that the Hanseatic merchants in Bruges have maintained for their own religious and social institutions, a preservation of identity against the assimilating pressures of a foreign city. The crack of ice sounds again as the temperature drops further in the hour before dawn, expanding in the night frost that has not yet begun to release its hold upon the world. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes of spiritual comfort, the liturgy in German that Veckenhusen attends with something approaching hunger, something that resembles the appetite with which he consumed his joyless breakfast. The Latin of the Flemish churches surrounds them daily. The French of the Burgundian court presses upon them in their negotiations. But here in the Hanseatic chapel, the words rise in the tongue of their childhood, of their distant homeland, of the families from which prolonged separation has estranged them. The prohibition on local marriage intensifies loneliness and reinforces temporary residence patterns, a deliberate estrangement that preserves the commercial community at the cost of individual attachment, that maintains the integrity of the Kontor network through the sacrifice of domestic settlement. The mass proceeds through its familiar movements, and Veckenhusen finds in its repetition a structure that opposes the formlessness of his exile, the shapelessness of days that extend without event or expectation of change. The weight of woolen layers presses against the knees that bend in genuflection, never quite enough against the damp cold that rises from the stone floor, that finds the gaps between garment and skin despite all the merchants' resources of cloth and fur. Veckenhusen spends mornings reconciling accounts by weak light, the errors carried over from autumn now found in the leisure that enforced isolation provides. You are standing in the Kontor counting house, where the smell of closed rooms concentrates around the lecterns where ledgers rest open, breath and bodies, and burning fuel mingling with the odor of ink and parchment, and the tallow of the candles that supplement the inadequate day. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes of numerical precision, the winter occupations that include account reconciliation, correspondence, negotiation of future contracts, and religious observance filling the hours that summer trade would have consumed in more visible forms of activity. The medieval warm period that had made such winters rare is now a memory preserved in the accounts of older merchants, in the records of voyages that once departed in months, now forbidden by ice. The little ice age has made Bruges a city of interior spaces, of candlelight and chimney smoke, and the intimate knowledge of one's fellow exiles that proximity without escape inevitably produces. The Kontor community provides mutual support during extended stays, including credit and shared resources that individual merchants might not command alone. Veckenhusen notes in his ledger the loans extended to a Bergen factor whose autumn shipments failed to arrive, the advances made to a young man from Visby whose first independent venture has been stranded by the freeze that came early and stayed late. These entries proceed in the cipher that protects commercial confidence, the abbreviations and conventions that constitute a language as specialized as the Latin of the law courts, as the German of the chapel liturgy. The plague caused population losses regionally up to 30%, and the accounts reveal this mortality in the crossed-out names of correspondents who will write no more, in the succession of heirs who inherit obligations they did not incur, in the adjustments that follow when a quarter of the trading community vanishes between one fair and the next. Some scholars argue for even higher death tolls in certain regions, and the ledgers suggest that these scholars may not be mistaken, the evidence of absence accumulating in margins where once familiar names no longer appear. The weight of woolen layers shifts as he rises, never quite enough against the damp cold that has penetrated despite the protection of the counting house, that seems to accumulate in the body across days and weeks of exposure. He walks through streets where afternoon brings a brief illusion of brightness, the snow reflecting what light the overcast sky permits, the frozen surfaces of the canals gleaming with a metallic sheen that suggests solidity where once there was movement, substance where once there was flow. Afternoons bring walks along the frozen quays, brief conversation with fellow exiles in the cold that makes speech an effort, that turns the breath to visible clouds that dissipate before the words they carry can fully form. You are standing at the edge of the harbour, where the empty masts stand in their winter dormancy, and the warehouses seal their contents against the damp that penetrates despite all precautions. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes of gossip and speculation, the news of distant markets that arrives only intermittently, that loses its currency in the delay between event and report. The smell of closed rooms reaches even here, breath and bodies, and burning fuel rising from the dense urban core to mingle with the sharper sense of ice and still water and the faint marine residue that clings to the wooden structures of the harbour. The Baltic ports regularly froze in this season, isolating merchants and delaying spring departures that had once seemed as certain as the calendar itself. Veckenhusen exchanges greetings with a man from Danzig whose cog remains trapped in the ice of the outer harbour, whose crew has been discharged to find what employment they can in a city that offers little to foreign labourers in a season of suspended trade. They speak of the uncertain political situation with England, the disputes over wool exports, and the privileges of the Styliad merchants that have complicated negotiations for the coming year. The aldermen will convene a meeting to discuss spring preparations, to assess what intelligence has reached them through the frozen channels of communication, to plan for contingencies that the prolonged isolation makes difficult to evaluate. The medieval warm period that had endured for so many centuries has gradually given way to cooler conditions, and the 14th century is experiencing increased climatic variability that makes such planning an exercise in probability rather than certainty, in the management of risk that no experience can fully quantify. The taste of preserved food turned monotonous returns to Veckenhusen's awareness as the afternoon walk concludes, and the evening meal approaches. The salt fish, dried peas, stale bread that constitute the winter diet of the Kontor community. Urban food supplies depend upon such preserved goods during winter months, fresh produce being virtually unavailable in a city isolated by ice from its agricultural hinterland, dependent upon the stores accumulated in autumn and depleted with mathematical certainty toward the spring that must come, that delays its coming beyond the patience of those who wait. The weight of woolen layers presses as he re-enters the Kontor house, never quite enough against the damp cold that the interior offers in diminished but still perceptible form, that the fires burning in every hearth can only partially dispel. The sound of wind in the bare branches of the courtyard tree reaches him through the shuttered windows, a whispered reminder of the world beyond the walls, of the natural processes that continue regardless of human discomfort, of the spring that will eventually release the tree from its dormancy as it will release the harbour from its ice. Veckentusen receives delayed news of his sister's marriage, the letter dated June only now arriving in January, carried by a ship that departed Lübeck before the freeze and reached Bruges only after the canals had already closed, its captain having waited at the estuary for conditions that never came, having finally transferred his passengers and correspondence to smaller craft that could navigate the remaining channels before these too became impassable. You are standing in the chamber where he reads this news, where the pale, brief sun above the Flemish plain offers no warmth through windows that admit light without consolation. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes of private emotion, the psychological toll of prolonged separation documented in merchant correspondence that accumulates in the Kontor archives, that attests to the cost of the commercial enterprise in terms less quantifiable than the ledger's record. The smell of closed rooms surrounds this reading, breath and bodies and burning fuel concentrated in the chamber where Veckentusen sits with the letter that tells him what he might have witnessed had winter not extended its dominion, had the medieval warm period persisted as it did for 4 centuries before this gradual giving way to cooler conditions. The crack of ice sounds in the evening stillness, expanding in the night frost that will continue until dawn, that makes of the city a crystalline structure fragile in its beauty, treacherous in its solidity. The Hanseatic merchants in Bruges maintained their own religious and social institutions to preserve identity, and Veckentusen attends Mass at the Hanseatic chapel again in the evening, the liturgy in German, a comfort that the morning service only partially provided, a comfort that the delayed news of his sister's marriage has made more necessary. The winter occupations that include account reconciliation, correspondence, negotiation of future contracts, and religious observance fill the hours without filling the absence that the prolonged separation creates, the psychological toll documented in merchant correspondence that Veckentusen himself contributes to, that he will add to tonight with his own delayed congratulations, his own expressions of regret for absence enforced by ice and policy alike. The weight of woolen layers shifts as he walks, never quite enough against the damp cold that the evening has intensified, that finds new paths through the protections he has assembled against it. He composes his letter by candlelight, the taste of preserved food turned monotonous, still lingering from the evening meal, the salt fish, dried peas, stale bread that sustain without nourishing, that maintain the body for the continuation of an existence whose rewards seem increasingly abstract, increasingly distant from the immediate conditions of his life. The alderman convenes a meeting to discuss spring preparations and the uncertain political situation with England, gathering the Kontor members in the hall where winter occupations have proceeded through the months of isolation. You are standing among the merchants who attend this assembly, where the smell of closed rooms concentrates the presence of bodies too long confined together, breath and bodies, and burning fuel mingling with the anxiety of men who have waited too long for movement, for change, for the release from stasis that spring must eventually bring. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes of information and intention, the plans for the season that approaches with uncertain pace, the negotiations that must be prepared against the resumption of navigation that the freeze has delayed beyond its usual term. The medieval warm period that had endured circa 900 to 1300 gradually gave way to cooler conditions, and the 14th century is experiencing increased climatic variability that makes such preparation an act of faith as much as of calculation, a commitment to future possibility that the present conditions do not obviously support. The Little Ice Age has made this winter exceptional even by the standards of recent decades, the Baltic ports having frozen early and completely, isolating merchants and delaying spring departures that the alderman's plans assume will occur, that his contracts and commitments require to occur. The uncertain political situation with England complicates these preparations. The disputes over wool exports and trading privileges that have accumulated through the autumn correspondence, now requiring resolution before the first cogs can load their spring cargoes. Veckentusen listens to the discussion, contributes his observations from the accounts that his mornings have reconciled, the errors carried over from autumn now found and corrected, providing a foundation for the projections that the meeting develops. The winter occupations have prepared him for this participation, have maintained his engagement with the commercial world, despite the isolation that the frozen canals impose. The weight of woolen layers presses against the benches where the merchants sit, never quite enough against the damp cold that rises from the floor, that finds the gaps between garment and skin despite the protection of the assembled bodies, the collective generation of heat that the hall's architecture cannot fully retain. The crack of ice sounds during a pause in the discussion, expanding in the night frost that continues even as the alderman speaks of spring, that persists as evidence of the distance between intention and condition, between the plans that words construct and the reality that the frozen world imposes. The Hanseatic merchants maintained their own religious and social institutions to preserve identity, and the alderman's authority derives partly from these institutions, from the continuity of practice that the chapel and the counting house and the common table represent. Veckentusen approves these plans, contributes to their formulation, accepts their constraints upon his own future action as he has accepted them in past years, as his father accepted them, as the generations of merchants who established this Kontor in a foreign city accepted the conditions of their profitable exile. The taste of preserved food turned monotonous returns to awareness as the assembly breaks for the midday meal, the salt fish, dried peas, stale bread that constitute the common provision, that maintain the body for the continuation of deliberation. Urban food supplies depend upon preserved goods during winter months, fresh produce being virtually unavailable, and the meeting consumes what the season provides, the merchants sustaining themselves upon the accumulated stores of autumn as they sustain their hopes upon the accumulated plans of the assembly. The weight of woolen layers presses as the merchants resume their seats, never quite enough against the damp cold that the meal has not diminished, that the communal warmth has not dispelled. The alderman continues his direction of the meeting, and the afternoon proceeds through the negotiation of future contracts, the allocation of spring cargoes, the distribution of risks that the uncertain political situation with England makes difficult to calculate. Veckentusen participates in these deliberations, his attention divided between the immediate matters of commerce and the persistent awareness of his sister's distant life, of the family events that proceed without his presence, that his exile makes him witness only through correspondence delayed by ice and distance. The psychological toll of prolonged separation is documented in merchant correspondence, and Veckentusen feels this toll in the fatigue that descends upon him as the meeting continues, in the difficulty of maintaining attention to matters that autumn energy would have found engaging, that winter lassitude renders abstract, remote from immediate meaning. The medieval warm period that had endured for 4 centuries has gradually given way to cooler conditions, and the 14th century is experiencing increased climatic variability that makes each year an uncertainty, each winter a test of endurance that the previous season has not fully prepared. The Little Ice Age has made of Bruges a city of endurance, of persistence against conditions that the medieval warm period would have found exceptional, that have become through repetition the normal expectation of those who trade in northern waters. The crack of ice sounds as the meeting concludes, expanding in the night frost that has begun while the merchants deliberated, that continues its slow work, regardless of human conclusion. You follow Veckentusen through the streets to the Kontor house, where the smell of closed rooms awaits his return, breath and bodies and burning fuel concentrated in the spaces that the meeting has left, that the evening will fill again with the presence of those who have no other place to be, no other community to join. The frost that held the canals through the long Bruges winter has begun to yield in the nights when the wind turns south, and you stand at the window of the Kontor house, where the morning light comes pale through glass that has known many such springs. Veckentusen has been awake since the bells of Notre Dame marked prime, his fingers already sorting the correspondence that will travel with him or remain for the man who follows, for the successor who will inherit the desk, the stool, the view of water that has been his for these years abroad. The smell of spring mud reaches even here, through the narrow streets where the earth releases its long hold after months of frost, where the ground has been locked and silent and is now beginning to remember softness, to give up the particular scent of thaw that merchants recognize before any other sign of the season's turning. Word comes with the bread and the weak ale of the morning meal, passed from mouth to mouth through the Kontor, before any written notice can arrive, before any official declaration seals what the water has already decided. The ice breaks up in the Haff, that broad lagoon where the Vistula meets the Baltic, where the cogs have been waiting through the months when navigation was impossible, when the sea itself refused passage. Spring thaw typically allowed Baltic navigation to resume by March, though ice could persist into April in severe years, and this year has been moderate, forgiving, the kind of season that old men will remember when they speak of better times to younger listeners who have not yet learned that every generation believes its own weather exceptional. The first cogs have sailed, the message runs, and with it runs the knowledge that the road back to Lübeck is open, that the suspension of winter is ending, that the life structured by departure and return can resume its pattern. You watch Veckentusen's hands as they fold the letter that brought this news, as they press the crease with a thumbnail worn smooth by years of handling paper, of counting coins, of gesturing through negotiations in languages that he speaks with the accent of the Hanseatic North. The sound of water dripping from the rigging will soon be everywhere, the thaw working its way through every vessel in every harbour where ice has held its temporary dominion. And this sound will follow him home, will mark the rhythm of his passage as clearly as any chart or compass bearing. Around him, the other merchants of the Kontor are making their own calculations, their own decisions about whether this year brings their return or extends their absence. For Hanseatic merchants often spent years abroad in rotation, their families remaining in home cities where the cycle of departure and return structured their lives across generations. The ledgers must be packed, the accounts settled, the threads of years gathered into bundles that can be carried or stored, that can survive the transition from one hand to another. Veckenhusen works through the morning in the chamber that has been his office, his presence, his identity in this foreign place, where he has been known as the man from Lübeck, the representative of the family, the brother who writes home with news of markets and prices and the health of mutual acquaintances. The particular smell of spring mud rises from the streets below, and he pauses at this scent as he might pause at a familiar voice, recognizing in it the approach of change, of movement, of the return that has occupied his thoughts through the darkest months when departure seemed impossibly distant. The accounts of the Bruges operation spread across the desk in their final arrangement, the profits calculated and allocated, the losses noted and explained, the whole story of these years rendered in the language of numbers that his brother will read, that his mother will hear spoken of in the evening room where the family gathers. Merchant wealth was invested in urban property, church donations, and daughters' dowries in home cities, and each of these categories receives its portion from the totals that his pen has traced, that his memory has held against the day of reckoning. He is one of those now whose absence has been long enough, whose presence is required where the decisions of the family are made, where the next generation must be prepared for its own years of departure. You follow him through the streets to the house of the alderman, where the respects due to position and to years of association must be paid before any physical departure can begin. The chamber there smells of the same closed rooms that awaited his return to the Kontor, breath and bodies and burning, fuel concentrated in spaces that the season has not yet released to open windows and to the moving air of spring. The conversation moves through the expected forms, through acknowledgements of service and of mutual benefit, through the recognition that his successor will need support, that the connections forged by years do not dissolve simply because one man boards a ship and another takes his place. The alderman's voice carries the weight of his office, and Veckenhusen listens with the patience of one who has learned that departure requires as much ceremony as arrival, that the road back to Lübeck begins in these rooms before any step is taken toward the quay. The settlement of accounts takes him through the afternoon, through the merchants who must be paid, the debts that must be collected, the web of obligation that has grown around his operations in these years of presence. Each transaction carries its own small history, its own memory of negotiation and compromise, of the trust that makes commerce possible across distances that would otherwise separate absolutely. The German term, Siedler, historically connoted group migration to distant regions, though Hanseatic merchants resisted permanent settlement, and this resistance lives in his movements now, in the refusal to let these ties become roots, to let this foreign place become home in any final sense. He is passing through, has always been passing through, even when the months accumulated into years, even when the faces around him became familiar as those of the city he left behind. The evening finds him in his room at the Kontor, where the small bundle that will travel with him lies open on the bed, where most possessions remain for his successor as they remained for him when he arrived, as they will remain when the next man comes to fill the space that departure empties. The sound of water dripping from the rigging reaches him through the window. The thaw everywhere now, working through every surface that winter claimed, returning the world to its proper element of motion and of change. He folds the garments that have served him, selects the documents that must not be trusted to any other transport, holds in his hands the small objects that have acquired meaning through proximity and through time. A letter seal, a pilgrim badge, a piece of stone from some northern beach whose location he no longer precisely remembers. The sleep that comes is shallow, interrupted by the awareness of morning, of the final arrangements that await the light. You are standing at the harbour as the dawn comes grey over the water, the cold air moving across your face with the particular quality of maritime spring, the moisture that carries both the memory of ice and the promise of its dissolution. Veckentusen arrives with his bundle, his steps on the quay marking the last of his presence in this place where he has been a figure, a name, a representative of distant interests. The cog waits at anchor, its hull dark with the waterline of winter storage, its sails furled in the configuration that will soon be changed for the passage north, for the journey that will carry him through the Danish straits to the waters that lead home. The boarding brings its own rituals, the recognition of fellow passengers who share his destination, his condition of return, his place in the cycle that has structured Hanseatic merchant lives across generations. Merchants completing their tour of duty exchange, looks that acknowledge common experience without requiring its explicit statement. The years abroad that have changed them in ways visible to those who have undergone similar change, invisible to those who have remained in the single place of their birth. The deck moves beneath his feet with the familiarity that returns without being summoned, the particular motion of a cog and a way that his body recognizes before his mind can name it. The passage up the coast follows the routes that generations have traced, that the Hanseatic League's peak influence came in the 14th century, before gradual decline in the 15th and 16th, and that still served in this present moment as the channels of commerce and of communication. The sight of the first migrating birds comes on the second day, northward over the Baltic, their formations dark against the pale sky, their cries carrying the same message of season and of direction that the thaw has already spoken. You stand at the rail and watch them pass, feeling in their movement the correspondence of your own, the shared quality of return that links all creatures who have known departure. The Danish straits bring their own landmarks, the familiar points that mark progress, that measure the diminishing distance between the self that has been abroad and the self that will be home. The Holy Roman Empire's decentralized structure, confirmed by the Golden Bull of 1356, allowed cities like Lübeck autonomy to pursue Hanseatic interests, and this autonomy has shaped the waters through which he passes, has created the conditions of his trade and of his return. The towers of Lübeck become visible from the deck on the morning of the final day, the Marienkirche rising above the salt warehouses with its distinctive profile that no other city can claim, that marks this place as the administrative and spiritual centre of the League, as the Queen of the Hansa that has called him back from his years of service. The taste of fresh bread on arrival comes with the first provisions taken aboard at the Lübeck quay, the luxury after preserved winter fare that has sustained him through the final weeks of the voyage. This bread carries the particular character of the city's baking, the water and the grain and the hands that have made it through generations unchanged in their essentials, recognizable to those who have eaten it from childhood. He chews slowly, standing at the rail as the cog makes its final approach, as the familiar cobblestones of Lübeck become visible, worn smooth by generations of Hanseatic boots, by the passage of those who have departed and returned, who have walked this way before him and will walk it after. The Marienkirche in Lübeck was the symbolic church of the Hanseatic merchant class, and its bells reach him across the water, deeper and more resonant than those of Bruges, carrying in their tone the particular weight of this place, this history, this community that has maintained itself through centuries of change. The evening bells of the Marienkirche mark the hour of his arrival, their sound falling across the harbour with the familiarity that he has carried in memory through all the months of absence, through all the mornings when other bells marked other hours in the city that was his temporary home. You follow him as he disembarks, as his feet find the cobblestones that have been waiting, that have known his step and will know it again. His brother meets him at the quay, the recognition immediate despite the changes that years have worked, the grey that has come to both their heads, the lines that the sun and the wind have drawn on faces that share a common origin. The warmth of his brother's house awaits, the fire built up for his return, the smell of home that encompasses more than any single element, that rises from the combination of stone and wood and cooking, and the particular presence of the family that has lived in this place. They walk together through the Kontor to the family house, where his mother waits, where the cycle of departure and return completes itself in the embrace that needs no words, in the recognition that time has passed, and that time has not passed, that the structure of the family has held against the distance that tested it. The evening settles around them, the fire drawing the room into its compass, the conversation moving through the necessary accounts of who has remained and who has departed in the years of his absence, of the marriages and the deaths and the births that have marked the family while he was elsewhere. Successful merchants retired to manage affairs from home, sending younger men or sons abroad, and this transition from merchant to rentier marked social advancement within the Hanseatic urban patriciate, the step that he has now taken, the position that he will occupy in the years that remain. The warmth of his brother's house surrounds him, the fire built up for his return, the smell of home that he will learn again, that he will absorb until it becomes indistinguishable from his own presence, his own contribution to the accumulated atmosphere of the place. His mother sits in the chair that has been hers through these years, her eyes following him with the mixture of recognition and adjustment that return always requires, the accommodation of the present self to the memory that has sustained the absence. She has lived this structure through the departures and returns of her husband, of her sons, of the whole community of which her family is part. The evening bells of the Marienkirche reach them through the closed windows, and she listens to them with him, sharing in the sound that marks this place as home, that has called him back from the years of his service. The conversation turns to the future, to the arrangements that his return makes possible, to the younger men or sons who will now take their turn in the pattern that has been established, that will continue until some future generation breaks it, or until the decline that history holds for all human arrangements finally reaches this community that has believed itself exceptional. Those who live in this present moment cannot know where they stand in this arc, whether the prosperity they enjoy represents continuation or ending, whether their own lives will be touched by the changes that time brings to all things. The fire settles in the grate, the warmth of his brother's house surrounding them, the smell of home that will be his now, that he will contribute to and be shaped by, that will mark the years of his presence as the years of his absence were marked by other smells, other sounds, other bells that spoke with different voices. You sit with them in the room where the evening has drawn in, where the particular smell of spring mud has been replaced by the interior sense of home, by the accumulated presence of lives lived in this space through generations of Hanseatic existence. The familiar cobblestones of Lübeck lie outside, worn smooth by generations of Hanseatic boots, and they will receive his steps in the mornings to come, will bear him to the Marienkirche that rises above the salt warehouses, to the administrative and spiritual centre of the League that has called him back. He has brought profits, correspondence, the completion of his tour of duty, has delivered them to the place where they belong, where they will be absorbed into the continuing life of the family and of the city. The night moves toward its deepest hour, the fire burning lower in the grate, the voices becoming fewer and more spaced, the silence that comes when the necessary things have been said and the unnecessary things have been left for other evenings, for the long succession of evenings that his return has made possible. He has returned to this service, has taken his place in the structure that depends on such returns, on the willingness of men to spend years abroad and then to come back, to bring what they have learned and what they have earned to the place that formed them. The warmth of his brother's house enfolds him, the fire built up for his return now burning to its embers, the smell of home that will be the atmosphere of his remaining years, that will accompany him into the sleep that comes finally, easily, the sleep of one who has completed the journey that was required, who has found the road back to Lübeck and has walked it to its end.